Good morning, members of the public. Good morning, guests. I'll come to you in a moment. Item 1 is apologies for absence. There are no apologies. So can I welcome everyone to the meeting? Could I ask members to check that your phones, etc., are either on silent or off? People watching on the webcast, if you'd like to follow at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag AssemblyBudget. Item 2 is declarations of interest. Members' declarations are circulated in the papers. Are there any others that you wish to disclose at this time? Thank you, members. Item 3, main item of business today. This is the final committee meeting to look at the Mayor's draft budget for 2018-19. Our guest today, David Galley, who is a 100% guest for this year's budget. He's been at every single meeting. Congratulations. Or commiserations, depending on your perspective.
Good evening.
David Bellamy, the Mayor's Chief of Staff, Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London, and Martin Clark, the Executive Director of Resources. Mr Mayor, I gather you wish to make an opening statement at the beginning. That's been common in all the other previous meetings, so over to you.
Morning. I want to start by wishing all committee members and all Assembly members and the GLA staff a happy new year. This budget is designed to improve the lives of all Londoners, no matter what their background or where they live in our city. It sets out the core priorities of my administration over the next financial year and how we intend to implement them, from investing in the genuinely affordable homes our city desperately needs, to tackling the scourges of knife crime and air pollution and making public transport more affordable. Everything in this budget is intended to enhance the quality of life in London, cement our city's standing as a world-leading hub of commerce and culture, and give Londoners the modern infrastructure and vital helping hand they need to fulfil their potential. Following the Brexit vote, it also contains measures to support London's businesses, large and small, at this time of heightened uncertainty. And its overarching goal is to help build an economy that works for all our communities and every Londoner. The issue that stands out above all others in this budget is funding for the Metropolitan Police Service. Keeping Londoners safe is my top priority and a responsibility that I take incredibly seriously. Over the last year, we've had 4 terrorist attacks and an awful fire at Grenfell Tower. I know all of us more recently were deeply shocked by the 4 horrific deaths in our city on New Year's Eve and are united in sending the message that if you use a knife in London, the full force of the law will be brought down upon you. You will be caught and you will be prosecuted. Unfortunately, despite lobbying from myself, the government is still failing to provide the Met with the funding and resources they need to keep Londoners safe. As Assembly members know, the government has forced the Met to make £600 million of cuts over recent years already, and the announcement on funding from the policing minister before Christmas was just smoke and mirrors. It doesn't fundamentally change anything, given the government's refusal to fund police pay awards. Clearly, this government thinks policing should be done on the cheap. But as the rise in violent crime in countless towns and cities across our country shows, cutting police budgets, particularly when there are other cuts across the public sector, has very real consequences. As Mayor, I will do everything in my power to protect London from rising crime and the serious terrorist threat we face. That's why I'm taking the action that, frankly, I do not want to take. Council tax is regressive, but there is a black hole in the police budget, so I'm asking Londoners to pay an average of 27 pence more a week through their council tax to contribute towards our city's safety. Of course, given that the government is responsible for over 70% of the Met's budget, this increase in council tax alone will not resolve the funding pressures. But the millions it promises to generate could reduce the impact and some of the very worst consequences of the government's cuts. Of course, there are many other elements to this budget that I look forward to discussing today. Additional funding for the London Fire Brigade to help them manage in the aftermath of the horrific Grenfell Tower fire, £3.15 billion for building new genuinely affordable homes, a freeze on all TfL fares while protecting concessions and investments, record investment in tackling air pollution and modernising our transport infrastructure, and money to further improve London's world-class cultural offering. I look forward to discussing these with you and answering your questions, Chair.
Thank you very much for that, Mr Mayor. And thank you also for setting out your priorities for the budget. That was the opening question, so I'm not going to ask it. How did your approach to setting the budget change compared to last year?
It's been a tough year. Last year was my first year, of course, so we went through a challenge process and we're getting on top of the various functional bodies as well. The key thing this year is obviously to make sure we address the issues around continued austerity. You'll be aware, Chair, from previous budget performance committees that for the core GLA as well as Fire Brigade and TfL, retained business rates has replaced government grant as a source of core funding. To give you a flavour, we worked out some number crunching on the numbers. So the core GLA is not budgeting to receive any specific revenue grants from central government. The London Fire Commission, as she's called now, is budgeting to receive, roughly speaking, £12.12 million in specific grants out of a funding requirement of almost 400 million, 3%. TfL is budgeting to receive 5% of grants from government, 49 million versus 984.8 million. LLDC and OPDC don't receive any direct funding from central government. For the police, however, government grant still provides the majority of funding, in total 90% of fund, 70%, beg pardon, just over 70% of funding from OPAC and MPS will be funded from government grants. Roughly speaking, 63% from Home Office police grants, 14% from specific grants. You'll also be aware, Chair, that we have, and I'm pleased and proud of this, delivered savings and efficiencies in the last year and next year. Next year we plan to make savings of £318 million, 318, with plans to deliver at least this sum in subsequent years. And you'll also be aware, Chair, TfL in the past has operated with huge deficits, supported, you'll be aware, by roughly speaking, in the recent past specific grants of £7 million a year. That's going. We've got to move from deficit to break even and to surplus by 2021. So you'll be aware of the challenges, and this year we've tried to grapple with some of those going forward.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. All of that will feature in subsequent sections during this morning's meeting. The police funding settlement was, as often happens, was quite late in the day, so just 2 days before you published your draft budget. How did you manage that? It was a bit lastminute.com. These things do happen. It's not just unique to this year, I can assure you. What impact did that have on your draft budget?
Well, just to give you a real example, it's not criticism, it's just how these things materialise. So on the day of the announcement from the police and minister, we weren't aware, for example, if the £12 increase took into account potential non-police precept increase we could or couldn't make, and so there was 24 hours of nervousness and emails and phone calls to and fro between us and CLG. That took some time. We then got confirmation that we were allowed to raise police precept by £12 maximum, and in fact there was an expectation we'd do so. But the good news as far as we're concerned is the government also agreed, CLG, that we could raise non-police precept by a maximum of 2.99%. That led to some, as you'll appreciate, not criticism, these things happen every year. Some number crunching taking place. The police and MOPAC were tasked with doing some calculations. I'll ask my chief of staff to come in a second just to give you an idea of how late in the day we received these. Not criticism, but Christmas and all the rest of it and stuff. Expectations of pay increases, you'll be aware of announcements already made by the Home Sec for 2% for this year. The police staff negotiations not been concluded, so it's been pretty difficult. We've got the most recent figures yesterday, which will probably change by next month, and I'll let David just explain briefly some of the challenges we have. And again, it's not a party political point; these things happen every year.
I mean, clearly we were very concerned to issue the consultation budget as quickly as we could, in order that there'd be good time for Londoners generally to respond, as well as obviously this committee to consider it. And I know this process requires a lot of officials in and around the Christmas period when they might, prefer to be doing other things. So yeah, very much we had a real period of getting clarity from DCLG about their, some of the technical aspects which weren't at first clear, and it was only by really the very end of the Tuesday, the day of the police settlement, that we obtained that, which then allowed the Mayor on Wednesday morning to make his proposals around council tax, which then gave officials really, I guess, just over 24 hours to update the figures and finalise the documentation, the explanatory notes, and then go through the process of cross-checking that David's team undertake before we put this out to try and ensure that everything does add up as one would expect it to. You think, obviously the decisions around the police precept and the police settlement more generally impact on the MOPAC budget. It wasn't possible in the time available to allocate out the additional income that resulted from those decisions into the objective analysis that the budget document presents, and so there's very much a holding line in the budget for that purpose. And what we're aiming to do, the Mayor and the Commissioner have already been discussing this, and work between MOPAC and MPS is underway, such that when the draft budget is published in mid-January following the consultation process that's currently underway and today represents an important part of, we'll be able to allocate that out into the appropriate places in the budget and show, as the Mayor said, both that impact and also the latest thinking around provision for pay review, given the indications that the government's made there. Similarly, in terms of the fire brigade, we were able to allocate in the additional funding the Mayor proposes there in terms of really their bottom line, given the situation around the deficits they were looking to be running in future years.
Thank you very much for that. The 2 points that you referred to there, the council tax surplus that is unallocated, the forecasted council tax surplus of 20 million that is in the budget. When the draft budget is finalised, if that materialises, what are your thoughts about where that is likely to end up? That's probably to you, Mr. Mayor, I think.
Well, firstly, let's hope it materialises. It is a one-off, and so it's not a recurring sum of money we can budget for in future years. So when it comes to deciding how we use that money, we have to bear in mind we can't expect to receive a similar, I don't want to use the phrase windfall, but let's use that phrase for the purpose of what it is for this year, that windfall for subsequent years. So the sort of thing I'll be looking at is what can we spend it on that's not going to be recurring in future years. And obviously, all submissions, if members of the committee want to make submissions, of course, we'll look at them like we always do.
Yeah, I think you might find amendments to your budget that might include that.
All I say, just bear in mind we can't spend it again.
No. That point is well made, and I think it's understood. And the same thing applies to the estimated £65 million share of the strategic investment funds. Are you going to treat that in the same way?
You mean the London Pool money?
Yes.
So with the London Pool money, a couple of things. Firstly, I'm less certain about that than I am about the £20 million, because obviously it depends upon the returns and stuff. With the London Pool money, the criteria is strategic investment projects. So the sort of things, top of my head, extending Bakerloo line, work around investment in the rural docks, are the sorts of things the agreement we have with London Council and the government is. So within those parameters, yeah, of course, all submissions received, and I think the Chief of Staff is actually in the process of what has written to various functional bodies asking for reasonable suggestions, bearing in mind they've got to be, they should be strategic investment projects rather than things that we'd be using other monies to spend on.
Okay.
Could I just add a little bit about timescales that might be helpful to the committee? So, in terms of the council tax collection fund surplus, as the Mayor says, a one-off, there will be proposals about that in the final draft budget in February, whatever that figure turns out to be. The reason for doing that is A, because we will have more certainty from the returns from billing authorities at the end of January, and B, because we also then will have more certainty about the business rate position, and it makes sense to consider those two factors together. In terms of the pool, we won't know precisely how much money will come in for that until about June 2019, after we've gone through that, and even then it's probably subject to slight amendments in future years. That doesn't mean, obviously, that we have to wait till then for the Mayor to take a decision, and given our cash flow facilities, we can spend it, but ultimately, if we form a view on prudently what the income's likely to be, 64.8 million is our current prudent assumption, but that may change when we get those returns at the end of January. Then obviously the Mayor will think about how to allocate that in a way that kind of gives us some flexibility if the reality turns out in future years to have been less positive than we predicted.
Okay, I think that's perfectly reasonable. Final little bit from me for the time being. The government have been capping the level of council tax since 2010. What are your views on the council tax cap?
I think council tax is regressive. We've got to recognise it's regressive. It's not an ideal form of taxation. You'll be aware, again, not a particular point, it's not been reviewed for a long period of time. So there are people who live in average-sized properties who pay only half those who pay council tax in massive, expensive properties. You'll also be aware it's not determined by income, it's by property. So I've got huge concerns about a regressive tax being used to fill a hole that's just too big for it to fill. I believe with increased devolution must come increased resources. What I don't want is cost shunting. We get given more responsibility but not the resources to pay for those costs. And so I'm all in favour of us having more devolution, more say over how we spend monies raised in London, but that shouldn't be limited to council tax. I know you're an advocate of the cross-party reports around the LFC. I think the government should look at a whole portfolio of taxes we can be in charge of, and so we can determine our own destiny. But in general terms, I think I'm in favour of lifting the cap on us, but I don't pretend, nor do I think it's recommended to assume the council tax can fill the massive hole that central government taxation pays for. We're all taxpayers, we pay taxes different ways. Could be council tax, income tax, other forms of taxation.
So in general terms, you would be in favour of the government taking the cap away or raising the level, as they have done this year?
I've been in favour of the government giving us more of the taxes raised in London to us.
I take that point, Mr Mayor, but I'm specifically interested in the cap.
So I'd be in favour of us having more flexibility to raise more council tax money if and when we need to do so. So, for example, I welcome the government increase in council tax police precept. There's actually an expectation on mayors and PCCs to go to the full £12. What I think is not sensible is for that to be used to fill a hole that central government's leaving.
Yeah, you've made that point, I understand that. Thank you. We're going to go through... before we move on, Assembly Member Berry?
I have two questions about council tax, if that's all right. So compared with last year, you have gone up across the GLA group to the limit that the government has set. Last year, you didn't. You raised it in the police part of the budget, but across the rest of the GLA, you left some headroom. It wasn't a great deal. It could have raised £4.3 million to the average household. It would have been about 3p extra a week. But it would have been £4.3 million in this year's base. You could have spent that during this year's budget. With the 3% increase, that would be, I think, around 4.4 million that would have been there in this year's budget on top of what you currently got. So do you regret not doing that last year and taking up the
Council tax is extremely regressive. We in London are facing a massive cost of living crisis. Before I became mayor, TfL fares went up by more than 42%. You've got a situation where the London living wage was not meeting the needs of Londoners. You know, because you've talked about the cost of childcare in London, difficulties getting deposits for rents. What I've sought to do over the last 18 months is try and address within the powers I have the cost of living crisis, freezing TfL fares, making sure we increase the London living wage, supporting those mothers in particular who need help with childcare, making sure we help those who need help with their deposit. The idea on top of that, increase in non-police precept council tax is not one that I find attractive. What I have said during the campaign for me to be the mayor is I wouldn't run away from raising council tax if it was to do with the safety of Londoners. So last year I raised the police precept to the maximum I was allowed. In the previous year, you remember, known as a black hole, the previous mayor cut the police precept. This year bearing in mind Grenfell, bearing in mind the concerns that the Fire Service have related to me, but also bearing in mind the massive black hole that the government simply is in filling. I've increased the non-police precept to address the issue of safety of Londoners, fire and police.
I was just asking because that is something we argued last year, and you seem to have changed your policy on that. I mean, as soon as the government said the limit was 3%, you immediately went up to that limit. My second question, though, is about, I mean, I do agree with you that council tax is regressive, and one of the worst things about it is the fact that people who used to get 100% relief for having very low incomes are now being charged by some councils a proportion of the council tax, which genuinely they can't afford. They don't have the incomes to cover it. Policies vary across London. My own council, Camden, introduced an 8.5% minimum payment a few years ago, and they've dropped that now. They've realised it was just charging people who couldn't afford it. People were going into arrears. Some councils this year are introducing it. Would you agree and call upon councils across London not to charge the poorest residents any council tax, that it isn't the right way to raise money, even to fill the gaps that they have?
I mean, the answer I give to you is the same answer I gave to the Chair in answer to a different question, which is councils like GLA, functional bodies, are trying to find ways to fill the black holes left by central government. You'll be aware, as a long-standing councillor, of the massive cuts your council's facing because of cuts made by central government. We are, and I've said this before publicly, the most centralised democracy in the Western world. The idea that councils have the flexibility to raise the monies they need, or they are allowed to spend the monies that the local taxpayers pay, is just not the case. And so I sympathise with councils having to fill this massive black hole. It's for locally elected councillors who know their communities the best to decide how to raise revenues.
I guess you wouldn't call on them to, I mean, given that you're increasing council tax, you wouldn't call on them to not charge that to the very poorest residents?
You either believe in devolution or you don't. And I trust local councillors like you to decide what's best for the residents in your ward, rather than a command and control from Whitehall or City Hall.
We'll continue to argue that with the councils, though. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go through functional body by functional body, and with a slightly deeper dive. And first up is police, and Assemblymember Prince is going to lead on that.
Happy New Year, Mr. Mayor.
Keith.
Mr. Mayor, as you are more aware than probably anyone else in London, the pressure on the Met is growing. Crime is increasing in London. What are you expecting the Met to achieve in 2018-19 with the budget that you've set, Mr. Mayor? Is it enough, do you think, to cut crime, or will it just be enough to slow down the increase?
It's a big question you've asked. So crime across the country is going up. It's been going up since 2014. Just to, in the context of crimes against the person, offences against the person, went up across the country, England and Wales, by 18% last year. In London, by just over 4%. So crime has been going up for the last 3 years. And actually, if you go back a period between 1994 and 2014, crime went down across the country, 94 to 2014. Across actually Europe, crime went down. It's going up. And there's a number of complex explanations those who are experts in criminology and sociology give. I'm quite clear that I think I'm an advocate of the two sentences, toughen crime, toughen the causes of crime. People often forget the second half, toughen the causes of crime. In Mayor's Question Time, a number of Assembly members have talked about a public health approach towards, for example, knife crime. There have been advocates, some of whom are here today, who've talked about investing in youth centres, who've talked about investing in public services, who've talked about investing in young people. And I think actually what you see now, in London in particular, because that's where my expertise is some of the downsides of not invested in smaller class sizes, in youth centres, in mental health provision, in children's services. And so it's not possible for me in City Hall by myself to reduce crime in London or across the country. What I can do is be an advocate for some of these policies of which I have no control, but also do what I can within the parameters that I have. So, for example, Keith, with the limited police budget we have, we aren't simply focusing on enforcement, important though that is. We saw in November and December Operation Winter Nights, which led to more than 900 arrests, more than 350 weapons being seized, including many knives and guns, but also invested in Red Thread, A&Es, we're invested in youth centres, we're invested in seed funding. I'd like to see crime go down, but bearing in mind what's happening across England and Wales, I think that's going to be tough. our priorities, as you'll be aware from the police and crime plan, are around knife crime, violence against women and girls, issues around vulnerability, big issue for us, hate crime, big issue for us as well. So our priorities in the police and crime plan, but I think when you speak to criminologists, they say with the best will in the world, the idea that we can by ourselves reduce crime when it's going up across England and Wales may be very difficult. And we're learning lessons, so we're learning from Scotland around knife crime, we're looking at New York around knife crime, and particular things if we can learn, we're willing to do so.
Right, thank you, that's very helpful actually.
Are you going to move on to another
No,
subject?
not just yet.
Okay.
I'm sticking with this bit for a minute. I absolutely agree with you that one of the ways to tackle crime is to get to the causes of crime. I think that's accepted actually. I did a lot of work on that in my own borough and in fact in Mopac. But a question I've got for you, if I could refer you to page 24 in this book here. Something just said that if we look at the line just below where it says total corporate budgets, Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime, or MOPAC as we affectionately call it, we can see that in 2020-21 the funding drops by about 7% down to 53 million. From my own experience, MOPAC is one of those bodies that actually does a lot of investment in prevention. Could you explain to me, Mr. De Mayor, why there's 7% coming out of that budget?
So why the MOPAC budget's going down, you mean?
Yeah.
Can I have a go at that? The MOPAC budget generally is made up, you can think of it in two broad categories. One is running costs of MOPAC as an organisation and the oversight and scrutiny function that it provides. The other is then its commissioning activity and the projects that it runs. What I imagine is that what you're seeing there is a point at which a project is coming to an end and it's the figures then step down. Clearly that's a couple of years in the future, and that doesn't imply that whatever that project is, there's not going to be some successor activity, and that's something that we will need to look at. But I think it's fair to say that the more detailed work has been done on really the 18-19 budget and immediately after, given the huge savings that need to be identified. That's something that will get looked at through the normal course of things.
Yeah,
I'm sure we can provide more detail.
My worry is,
writing.
Mr. Mayor, that it might well be, say, the money that's given to the SMBs, or might be money given to some of the projects.
Understood. No, that's a good question. Just to reassure you also, don't forget, we also, besides the core funding, we apply for specific grant funding, we apply for transformation funding, we apply for specific pots of money. So it could all be one of those pots of money coming to an end. Right. But we are very good, and we're quite assiduous at applying for funding available and stuff, whether it's online crime hub, other things we're doing and stuff. So I'm happy to get a note done to explain the difference.
See if there's something significant
to reassure all of us.
No, thank you, that's very helpful. But in the original question I asked, and it is, seriously, it's not a trick question, because I have absolute sympathy with the position that you find yourself, and I'm very happy to help lobby government for more money and so on. But the question was, do we think that what the budget you've set is enough to cut crime, Mr. Mayor, or do we think it's just going to retard it at the moment?
Well, clearly the resources aren't enough to do the things we want to do. And that's why we're lobbying for additional resources from the government. You'll have heard the Commissioner and the Deputy Commissioner, and by the way, this is the first time publicly I've been before you. Can I congratulate Sir Craig?
Yes,
I know you did when you were there. But Sir Craig and the Commissioner have publicly talked about their concern about some of they use the phrase proactive, preventative work they're doing now, not being able to do in the future. The example I think Craig gave was if we were to go down to sort of 27,000 officers, question whether the school safety officers would carry on in their role. We've only just reintroduced those school safety officers, and you're an advocate, as indeed I am, of neighbourhood policing, the Bobby on the beat, give them intelligence information that helps them fight crime. that connection is made more difficult with fewer officers, and so it is difficult. And so, this provides all of us with an opportunity to thank our officers for working incredibly hard, bearing in mind many of them have to cancel rest days, many of them having to work overtime to meet the shortages we have. It is difficult in London at the moment, and it's not going to get it easier if we don't get additional resources from central government, even if, and we'll come into this later on I'm sure, even if we raise the maximum we can this year, circa £50 million, because the government's not funding the police pay increase, well, this money just goes into paying for the police pay increase, well deserved though that is. So I wouldn't want an impression to be created that the policing minister has manufactured more money for us. He hasn't. He simply, as I said in my introduction, is a combination of smoke and mirrors.
Okay. I'm going to come back to the police numbers and so on in a while, but if you wanted to come in.
Assemblyman Deval?
And there is the dilemma, Mr. Mayor, and I think you said it yourself, is that the future of policing is about a struggle between reactive policing, which is fine and is needed and necessary, to proactive policing to try to force down some of these crimes. All your strategies are about that proactive approach in terms of some of those issues. But in terms of, would you describe this budget as the turning point? And do we now need to, during this budget year, start to think about a different way of policing if we're going to win that struggle as government walks away, right? Because it's walking away from this conversation about reactive policing, sort of proactive, longer-term problem-solving issues. And I'm talking about what the police are responsible for, not what other partners are, because they are the number one agency in tackling crime. What during this year is your thinking about future budgets and where do we go?
This is the crux of the policing conundrum. So when I met with recently the Commissioner for New York's police force, and I met last year with the Mayor of New York, they are doing stuff we were doing 10 years ago, increasing police numbers, neighbourhood policing. They've got, roughly speaking, 36,000 police officers for a similar sized population as London, a bit less than we are. They're a better comparator for London than, say, not being disparaging towards Manchester or Birmingham, West Midlands or Greater Manchester. They're a better comparator for us. What's clear to me is when you look at the past success of the Met Police, the current success of New York and others, it's a combination of prevention and almost like an A&E for once criminality happens. My view after speaking to the experts, including the Commissioner, is we wouldn't want to sacrifice one over the other. We'd have to do less reaction. In other words, this is the triaging that Sir Craig and others have talked about, and this has led to some criticism in the media about what the priorities are some types of crimes not having the response we would like them to have. Because what you can't afford to do is respond to everything and do no prevention work. I think what you'll see then going forward is less prevention work than we'd like, but still some. Not doing the full reaction we'd like, but still doing a lot of it. And that's just the nature of finite resources being rationed. Now, the question you're coming to is, do we sacrifice prevent completely to do as much reaction as we can, or do we sacrifice reaction completely and do as much prevention as we can? I think you'll see less of both, but still both need to be done. You speak to excellent police officers, they will tell you, and by the way, from counter-terror officers down, they will tell you how important the, if you like, public health side of policing is, the stuff that we've talked about in previous MQTs and plenaries. It's so important. If you can stop, for example, a young person being a first-time offender by the time they're 18, mission accomplished. There are very few adults who are first-time offenders, which is why investing in young people is so important. But the problem is this now, Len. We're seeing now for the first time in a long time, young people who are arrested, prosecuted, charged, going to custody, reoffending more than they were in the past. Reoffending rates for young people has gone up from, roughly speaking, 35%, unacceptable, to 40%. And so it's a revolving door, which is why I think the cuts across the public sector are linked with the rise in crime across the country.
Yes and no, because let's say now there are some people who have got a propensity to violence at a young age. I used to work with young people who will come nowhere near the youth service or any other diversion schemes. There's a different strategy required and a different early warning. And I think you pointed out there's some issues in the classroom. I think the question we've got to focus on is what can we do now? And now I think you hit on the other issue, but it's not really seen in the police narrative at the moment. And it goes like this. So if it's about reoffending and how do we stop and intervene on reoffending, where are the programmes? There's some interesting ones in America, and we've had stop and start on this. Some things are not new. I don't see some of that in there. You know, I think the police have made some mistakes in the past when they've done it and concentrated on reoffenders just on a ward-based approach. I don't think we haven't got the resources to do that. But I'm much more targeted about those reoffenders and driving some of those around. We've talked about that in domestic abuse, but there's other issues around violence, there's other issues around criminality that need to do it. It's not all our young people, it's a small number, but equally, those who commit crimes in our society have a disproportionate effect. And the real issue is, at some stage certainly in this future budget, if I've reconciled myself that the government isn't going to listen, it's not going to do, we are going to have less resources to do it. Yes, our partnership working is going to need to increase in a different way. But some of the programmes I don't hear being talked about in the past. Is that because we haven't got the police resources to do it? But in some cases, I don't mind that, but someone's got to do the work to say, no, they wouldn't make a difference now, or no, we can't afford to do that. So the issues around tackling reoffending, I don't see. When we go later on in terms of police numbers, which I don't really want to go into, but just to give an example, I don't think it's the be-all and end-all, but there's no relationship to the specials being increased. Now, that won't solve the real gap about full-time police officers, but it might relieve some of the pressures on Friday, Saturday night in some of our town centres or in other criminal activity where there are specialised specials, if I can call it that. So I just think there's something in the narrative that's missing from the longer-term solution, which you're trying to do to keep both. You need to keep the reactive as well as that proactive long-terming. And there's some of the things that are missing around that. And I think what you're saying is right, but I'm not sure with the challenges the police face that we are in all those buttons, because they're not talking about those in the forums where I expect them to be spoken about, and the programmes being thought to say, yeah, we've got a programme for that.
Can I say the bad news is in the short term, I don't see the removal of silos. What you're actually articulating is my frustration as well with the silos, whether it's police, whether it's youth services, whether it's mental health budgets, education budgets. And so one of the things I was optimistic about in relation to devolution of justice is we can do more work at prevention, but also reoffending, and also, because you're right, Louise Casey did a report a few years ago identifying X hundred, I don't know this phrase, but it's the phrase she used, troubled families. And these were a small number of people causing a large number of the issues. If you call it the frequent flyer customers. And her work was fascinating because it showed with intensive work with these families, you could prevent lots of issues, but also these would become law-abiding citizens who would contribute to society. That work hasn't been followed up by, I think it was work done for the coalition government, may have been, her report was done for them. It's a really good report. It's not been followed up, and so you're articulating the frustration I have as well with the lack of joined-upness. We see some of the good work in joined-upness around young people, the work that that came out of the neighbourhood plans with young people, triaging them away from criminal justice service. I'm afraid, and again, the cuts has had an impact on the ability of local authorities to work with youth services, social services, schools and others to divert people away. We can't pretend otherwise, but it's a lost opportunity, because if you can stop somebody committing an offence before they're 18, mission accomplished, they fall in love, they find a job, they want to buy a home, and they walk away from criminality. And so that's why it's frustrating, and I share your frustration.
Okay, Senator Prince, do you want to pick up this road?
Thank you. Clearly, from the discussions we've already had, the Met is going to have to prioritise its work. And as we've already accepted, the capacity of the Met is limited. Could you tell me, Mr. Mayor, how will MOPAC engage with Londoners to ensure that the priorities set by your good self, your Deputy Mayor and MOPAC are actually in line with those priorities that Londoners believe are the priorities? How are you going to liaise or engage with Londoners to find out what their real priorities are?
So, firstly, this is important because if the Londoners haven't got confidence in the police service, they won't come forward with intelligence, they won't report crimes, there won't be witnesses, etc., etc. So it's important, in a policing sense, it's important to get engagement right. So MOPAC are working on a public engagement strategy because I think what you're articulating is a frustration you probably hear from your constituents about not feeling part of the solution, not having their views heard, and so we've got to have a better strategy of informing, engaging, and empowering communities. One of the things that I did at the last Mayor's Question Time is say we're going to look at the lessons learned from public access consultation. Clearly there were criticisms made by colleagues around this room, but also out there how we can improve that. And so we've got to get it right, because if you're a police officer, if you're a community support officer, if you're a special, your job is made much easier if the public understands what you're going through and wants to help and cooperate with the investigations you're doing. So MOPEC are working on that now, and I'm very happy for Mia Sophie to drop you a note about timelines from the public. Engagement is very different from the access strategy work we did last year. You're well aware of with the police station front counters and stuff. This is engagement, including community hubs, including where they are in communities and how we engage better with the Londoners.
Yeah, I think, it was good that public access consultation was done, but it wasn't, I think as you already accept, it wasn't done in a good way. And certainly I would say, as far as my borough is concerned, very, very keen to work with MOPAC to publicise, to even provide, I suspect, accommodation or venues, but they need to know at an earlier stage, and it was all the notification was very last minute, and that's why there were so few people attending those events.
See why it's so important. For example, the dedicated ward officers, your constituents could advise where the best place for them to come is. Your constituents could advise, because they know the community better, where people gather around, where the dedicated ward officers spend most of their time, etc., etc. So it's really important in relation to the dedicated ward officers being more effective, and they're professionals, so we want to make it work, and I'll make sure I'll drop you a line about timelines.
Yeah,
so
really
you can,
helpful.
I think your good advice is the sooner you know, the better you can feed in. So
I'm personally very happy to have publicised it, but I'm sure the borough will do as well. Okay, if we can actually move on to police numbers now, Mr. Mayor. I believe your budget is based on an operating figure of around about 30,000 officers. That's the new baseline. And that's from 2018-19 onwards. Have you calculated, Mr. Mayor, what the council tax increases would need to be in future in order to keep them at this level? If we were to assume that the government grant was flatlined, for want of a better word, in cash terms, do you have an idea of what you might want to go to the government and ask for in the means of a percentage of increase in council tax in order to maintain that 30,000 level? Because in an earlier meeting we did discuss it maybe even dropping down below that figure, which I think we will agree would be undesirable.
Sure. It's difficult to answer that question because there are too many unknowns. Let me tell you why. So just to remind ourselves, over the next year, the average is 30,000. It may go below 30,000.
Yeah, no,
roughly speaking, in each year, between 1,500 and 2,000 officers retire, and we're not stopping recruitment for the reason we've discussed before. You don't want to close a tap, and so we're still recruiting and stuff. But the average will be 30,000, sometimes a bit higher, so it will go below. The reason why it's difficult to predict what council tax we need to raise in future years to keep it at an average of 30,000 is, let's say next year the government also expects us to raise £12 on the police precept. Let's say, for example, next year the government for non-police precept doesn't say 1.9, doesn't say 2.9, it says 1.99. Let's say the government goes back to 1.99. Let's say some of the hypotheticals the chair talked about council tax caps will realise. It's difficult for us to predict the monies we have to raise via council tax to meet an average of 30,000 officers. And there are also unforeseen things happening as well. We talked about the unforeseen in the fire service with Grenfell and the consequences of that. So it's difficult to forward plan about police grant settlements next year and subsequent years without knowing what they're going to be or what the rules around council tax are going to be.
But the calculation could be done, couldn't it, Mr. Mayor, if we were to make some assumptions. I mean, let's not worry about the council tax precept, the general one, because we don't. But we have a Met precept. The government have allowed you to raise it by, say, £12 council level D, whatever. But there must be. I'm not asking anyone to do it now, by the way. But there must be a figure where we could actually calculate what level of increase we would need to do in order to maintain that 30. And it may be worth, Mr. Mayor, doing that calculation so that not just yourself but others can also lobby the government to say, look, this is the sort of money we're looking at.
What police pay increase would you want us to use?
Well, that's my next question. So if you wouldn't park that, but we can do two models, can't we? So if we can do one, assuming whatever the percentage we think it's going to be. And
what do you think they deserve?
Pardon?
What do you think they deserve?
Well, I think they deserve all the money we can pay them, actually, Mr. Mayor, because they do a fantastic job.
Are you willing to fund it?
Pardon?
Are you willing to fund it?
Personally, if I was wealthy enough, of course I would be. Unfortunately, I'm not. But it's not a trick question, Mr. Mayor. It's just trying to give us some baselines in which to work. Yeah, we're very happy within my party. We're very happy to work with you on a number of issues. Policing is definitely one of them. But we need to have some baselines in which to work.
Can I be helpful then in terms of what I think next steps are and how that will give more visibility about this, and also perhaps explain why this is a challenge in terms of the amounts that could be required of council tax. So as we discussed in response to earlier questions, with the police settlement coming out so close to when we needed to publish the consultation budget, we haven't had the opportunity to play the consequences of that and the Mayor's decisions around council tax through the figures yet. So we will do that for the draft final budget, which we will publish in mid-January. What we will need to do, obviously, to do that is, and the government saying that basically police and crime commissioners are on their own in terms of funding police pay increases. Of course, that's both the police officer pay, which is set by the Home Secretary, and it's also police staff pay as well, which is a matter for negotiation for the Met and their employees. So what we're going to need to do in updating the budget is we're going to need to come to an assumption about what we should, for this year and future years, build in for pay rises. At the moment, that's 1%. I don't think people would feel that that's necessarily appropriate or what officers and police staff would deserve, but equally everybody can see the financial challenge and understand why that figure was put in. The Mayor and the Commissioner have discussed this topic. There's more detailed work going on between the Met and MOPAC this week, including discussions with other chief constables and with other police and crime commissioners, just to try and say, right, as submissions are prepared into the independent pay review body, what sort of figure should we be looking for? And without knowing either what they will recommend or what the Home Secretary will then decide, noting that last year the Home Secretary didn't accept the recommendation from the independent pay review body, what is appropriate for us to put into our budget for planning purposes. And so, as I say, that work's been done, and we'll put that in for mid-January. That then provides a basis on, the assumptions are made, you can see the gap of savings, and then you can do calculations. If you say, well, 1% extra on council tax would bring in X million pounds, we can all do that maths. It becomes quite straightforward. The other point to make about this is, as the Mayor said earlier, the government provides just over 70% of the Met's income. A few percent of the Met's income, I forget the precise figure, comes from, for instance, Transport for London. It would come from Heathrow Airport. A small amount of it would come from football clubs, and there are sources like that.
Very small amount.
A topic which we've discussed before, and so the balance of that is what comes from the mayor, a little bit from business rates, but overwhelmingly from council tax. And so really what I'm saying is that if the government is going to freeze police grants, freeze National International Capital Cities grant, then what you see is to deal with the inflationary consequences, meet the inflationary needs of areas funded by that money, council tax would have to bear a very significant and disproportionate burden. And noting what the mayor said earlier about council tax as a regressive tax, it's clearly not a very desirable situation.
Okay. That's very helpful, David.
Before you move off the issue
I'm sticking with it at the moment. Can I just say?
Well, actually, I think some clarification is possibly required. The additional money raised by the council tax increase, the mayor rounded it up to around about ballpark £50 million. The pay increase that we're talking about, the consolidated pay increase is 1% that you've just said, Mr. Bellamy. The extra 1% that the government are talking about, in the draft budget, you've costed that at £5 million in the 18-19 financial year and 7 for the 17-18 financial year. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the cost of police officers.
Yeah, no, I'm not talking about police staff, I'm talking about police officers. I understand that there will be a separate cost on police staff.
1% of onto the Met pay bill. Obviously, things that are non-consolidated have different impact on pensions and things like that, which you'll appreciate. The rule of thumb is that 1% on to the pay of Met officers and police staff is about £25 million.
If it was consolidated.
Which
is at the moment, and I appreciate that may change going forward.
Yeah.
But I wanted to make sure that was clear. Sorry, Assembly Member Prince.
Sorry, that was my next question. Mine?
Apologies.
That's fine, Chairman's privilege.
Mind reading is not very good.
Okay. So, but, that was helpful what you said there, David. But you understand the question I'm asking. And would it be possible for someone to just whack up those numbers, you think?
So when we produce the next budget, that will give us an updated savings to be identified figure, and then it's fairly easy for us all to do the maths on what that might entail.
All right, I've got just one more question really. If we can refer back to the page 24, which is probably on there already. Above the heading total corporate budgets, if we look at the centrally held line, you see that this year it was 75, but actually came out at 86. But then it kind of doubles and then raises quite significantly. And because it's centrally held, it doesn't really tell us, one, what it's doing, and two, why there should be such a massive jump in the size of that budget line. Can anyone offer an explanation for that?
I'm not sure. I mean, David may have more detail. I'm not sure personally I can add too much more to what the Met Director of Finance said before you last week when she explained that. If we need more, David, you can add anything you've got, and then if we need more detail, obviously we're happy to provide that.
Generally, the Met would hold a central contingency, which they then allocate when inflation is known. So their policy has been in the past at this stage not to allocate.
Assembly Member Pigeon.
I just wanted to come back to the police officer number point, Mr. Mayor. You have said today that the average is going to be 30,000, so the reality is we know it will dip below that. In your police and crime plan, your strategic target is 32,000. Is the reality now that is not going to be achieved, and so you're going to give up on that, as it were, and that you're going to focus as 30,000 is what we're going to be able to afford going forward?
As a direct consequence of government policy, the strategic target of 30,000 officers has gone.
So 30,000 is really what we're desperately now trying to hold on to going forward.
Well, I can't predict what's going to happen in 1920. What we're budgeting for in 18-19 is an average of 30,000 police officers, and the Commissioner is working incredibly hard to make sure she can meet the needs of Londoners with an average of 30,000 officers. It's going to be tough.
Is your hope that that is what you're going to be able to maintain going forward? Or?
Yeah, well, so you're alluding to sort of, I think that's what Keith was getting to in relation to the next 3 years. From what his question, I'm just reposing Keith's exam question in a different way. How do we finance an average of 30,000 officers between now and 2020, 21? And it's difficult for the reasons David Bellamy and I have articulated, that there's so many unknowns. But obviously we'll try our best to continue to make efficiency savings working with the Met. The Met have worked incredibly hard on estates, on back office, on police staff, on CSOs, on police buildings, front counters, on IT, on uniforms, on procurement. They will carry on being as lean as they can, but it's going to be hard.
In terms of IT and digital policing, we've expressed our concern many times as a committee that we haven't seen the savings that have been promised. Has your Chief Digital Officer started to get involved in this, and is he able to add some pressure and expertise here to perhaps see more savings delivered?
So the Mayor's Chief Digital Officer is getting involved. He's had meetings with MOPAC, and he's meeting the Mayor. I don't know whether that happened end of last week or whether it's this week. I forget, but I know absolutely it's happening. He obviously can bring to bear his experience in terms of public sector IT. What I would say though is that it's not just this is not about one person and their experience. I think the Met has now, in my view, a very strong CIO. You can start seeing the changes as they've moved the internal model. They've actually got more kind of permanent leadership staff than they had there in the past. And as I think the Deputy Commissioner described to you last week, we're starting to see some impressive achievements in terms of body-worn video rolling out on such a large scale, particularly with the back office systems connecting to CPS. We're now seeing the rollout of tablets and mobile devices and laptops, which is, as that's running, it's starting to have a real positive impact. The Met's new website, which provides an important portal for those who want to report certain types of crime online. When it went live, that's won awards. They've moved in terms of tackling the legacy. So they identified some amount of savings that can be made, which are built into the budget now, and they have, as part of that, gone down successfully from 5 data centres to 2. So. Yeah, there's a positive story beginning to emerge there. There's absolutely no room for complacency about this stuff, and both the Met's governance and the MOPAC governance over that is really, really important. And clearly, in terms of the transformation needed around the command and control system and the Met's investigative system, those are really big, significant projects which are going to need a real degree of focus. Because what's clear around all of this is that if we've got a challenge about the physical number of officers we're able to afford to employ, then we have to be giving them the tools in order that they can be as efficient and effective as possible.
Let's just so we're clear, so there's no misunderstanding, Caroline. I don't want the impression to be created that updating the outdated technology will lead to massive savings. If you read the most recent HMI report, he was very critical of some of the consequences of outdated technology. And so it's got to be done. But I think this time last year, the chair in particular was rightly very critical about promises made and the Met police officers having the skill sets. I'm paraphrasing the chair, and he'll forgive me for doing so. Having the skill sets to give the reassurance the Chief of Staff has just given. I'm more confident now than I was 12 months ago, but you're right to bear down on this because I've revisited previous evidences given by previous mayors and scrutiny by budget performance and by me last year, and often the expectations haven't been realised, and so you're right to pressurise us, but I don't want a misunderstanding about the reasons for the replacement of the outdated technology. Of course we want to make savings. Going from 5 data centres to 2 or 3 makes savings and all that sort of stuff, but actually the priority is proper policing and giving the police the tools they need to do their job.
Thank you.
The Police Transformation Fund, Mr Mayor, we heard from the police in our evidence for the report that we did on who's paying the bill. There's £300 million available in the next financial year and 700 thereafter. but it's for police forces across the country to work together in order to realise those funds. Have you been given any indication from the government the amount of money the Met may get in the next financial year from that?
No. And so just there's money we've already got from the Transformation Fund, the stuff we talk about, online crime hub, the collaborative procurement around uniforms, etc., the graduate conversion scheme, the child house, and so there's that money is already there. There's the £450 million the police minister announced recently before Christmas, 450 split up, roughly speaking, £50 million counter-terror, 270 for the council tax, £12, 130-ish transformation fund. So we'll be bidding for some of that money, as you'd expect. It's not new money, just the bad news. It's money that was previously there for transformation fund that we'll bid for. The criticism of the Met in the past, which I take on the chin, is we have not been a team player with other forces around the country. And the new commissioner in particular is really keen to be collaborative, collegiate, and work with others, College of Law and others. And I'm quite excited about the opportunities in relation to working with other police forces around the country. You'll be aware from the evidence given by Craig, Sophie and others last week, is the Deputy Mayor for Police and Crime does work very hard with other PCCs. I think she's just making a phone call today, with teleconference today. And we are keen to be a team player. I think one of the responsibilities of being the biggest police force in the country is being collegiate, collaborative and a good partner.
Yes, well, that would make a refreshing change, because the Met playing with others is not something they've historically...
No, the Commissioner is really committed to this, she really is.
Yeah. Do you think that the Met is now operating on maximum efficiency?
No, I think we can always be more efficient. And one of the things, I think the Commissioner's having a way day tomorrow Wednesday to discuss some of this stuff. I addressed the senior management team shortly before Christmas. They're working really hard to be as efficient as they can be. Some of the innovation is making them more efficient, using tablets rather than going back, filling in notes, making phone calls. You can get a report from police force around the country to your tablet, and when you're out on the street, it makes a big difference. There are always efficiency savings that they can make. The ambition, if you remember, when we went last year, was to have back office costs roughly speaking 15%. And your eyebrows sort of being raised about the possibility of doing that. I think we're roughly speaking at 18%. It's going to be tough getting to 15%. If we can get there, it'll be fantastic. But you'll be aware the biggest expense we have, roughly 75%, is staff. And in crude economic terms, the way you make staff more efficient is by having less staff. The old saying, rather than having one teacher with 30 students, have one teacher with 60, that could be arguably more efficient. Well, we know from conversations we've had, actually, neighbourhood policing relies upon officers, human beings, and so there'll always be a limit on how efficient we can be, because we believe human beings matter. But we're keen to configure these estates better. You'll be aware of the conversation we've had about making these estates more efficient. One of the reasons why the previous mayor and I have sold off some of the police estates, because we don't really need it. One of the things we're keen to keep an eye on, though, is and it's an issue raised by other Assembly members, is response time. So there's a perception amongst the public that the police service is similar to the fire service. The fire service, to go and put out a fire, go back to the fire station. The police don't operate like that. The police go out, deal with a crime, deal with an incident, they go to another one, then go to another one. They don't come back to base, and so they can always be more efficient. But we've got a commissioner and a senior management team and a deputy mayor who are making sure we can be as efficient as we can. Okay. Part of it, by the way, is learning from other police forces. I'll give you one example. Merseyside last year, I was interested to discover, Merseyside police force, 40% of crimes were dealt with on the phone. In other words, it wasn't a triage process. It wasn't of the seriousness for a police officer to go out and meet with a member of the public to the satisfaction of the member of the public. 40%. Ours was lower than that, and so we're moving towards being more efficient by that, using online, using phones, using text, and other ways to make the police service more efficient.
You touched on the ambition to have 15% of spend being on back office, or to reduce it to 15%. And I understand entirely the political reason why you would make that a priority. There was some scepticism expressed about the achievability of that when we were looking into it from police witnesses from around the country, not just in the Metropolitan Police. Do you still believe that that is a viable target?
It's going to be tough. The Met Police Service is still working towards that. I mean, I've seen no evidence why it can't be done. They've not yet thrown in the towel.
I think the scepticism was that it never has been done. Anyway.
No, that's correct. And the max, I think the best is around 17%. And you're right. I mean, that's why last year you expressed yourself some scepticism.
Caution,
I
say.
I think the value in it for me is that it's about constantly having the challenge and saying, well, look, we don't want money to be spent on back office unless there's really good justification. So if that is one of these stretch targets that in reality you probably can't get, at least it focuses the mind on actually ensuring we do think about that sort of stuff.
The danger, I mean, a former colleague of ours who now occupies a place in the House of Lords talked about this a lot, Baroness Jones I'm referring to, is that you could achieve that target and then find that warranted police officers are doing back office functions and they're not on the street, and that is always the trade-off.
Okay, so on that point, one of the things that I've been keen to avoid is just that happening, because you look at police staff cuts. So we've lost in police staff numbers from 2010 to now 4,345 police staff. And so you're absolutely right. The concern is if you've got less civilian staff doing stuff that they could be doing, you've got trained officers doing stuff they shouldn't really be doing. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not saying the tablets are the panacea. Having the tablets and better IT may free up some of the back office stuff. You're absolutely right. It'd be perverse for trained officers to be in stuff that civilian staff could be doing cheaper. And so we've got to keep an eye on that.
Okay. We're going to hand back to Assemblymember Prince and then we're going to move on.
Thank you. You, like I, place a lot of importance on neighbourhood policing, Mr Mayor. But, and I know I'm a bit of a lone voice on this one, but could I ask you, you have a, and I believe you've virtually achieved it actually, a target of having 2 police officers per ward. I believe that's almost achieved now across London, which is commendable. But what I'm hearing from different parts of London is that does rather limit the flexibility of the police in allocating resources. And would you consider, Mr Mayor, seeing there's a real pressure on police numbers now, when there was 32,000 that may have been easier to deliver, would you consider making that more of an aspiration than a target? Not often that I ask you to go from from a target to an aspiration, usually the other way around, but could it be an aspiration so that in some boroughs where there's a ward where very little crime is committed, they can go down to 1 maybe, and then perhaps put 3 in where there's a ward where they need more?
This is a promise made and a promise delivered. By the end of last year, every ward in London has at least 2 dedicated ward officers and 1 community support officer. How officers are used is an operational matter for the borough commander and senior officers, but there's an expectation, unless there are exceptional reasons, each ward will have at least 2 DWOs and 1 CSO. Some wards have more dedicated ward officers, and so that's an operational matter for the borough commander. When we move towards, subject to consultation and review, basic command units, obviously there'll be other pressures on the borough commanders and those in charge of the police in the BCUs. But the expectation is for, unless there are exceptional reasons, for there to be 2 DWOs and 1 CSO. And we're also making, you'll be aware, complementing school support officers for the reasons we've said. Currently 310, I think. We're hoping to get even more as officers, as schools show their willingness to have these school safety officers. They're really important for policing.
But my question is, Mr Mayor, and I agree with everything you said, is could you not consider making an aspiration so it gives the borough commanders a little bit more flexibility?
Well, you'll be aware when the previous mayor got rid of neighbourhood policing, it led to huge sorts of issues around London, with some wards not seeing a police officer for love of money. Not because police officers weren't working hard, but because they weren't walking the streets, getting to other communities and finding out the important intelligence they need. Senior officers support the move towards dedicated ward officers. They think it's effective in policing. Counter-terror officers from violent crime, officers doing violent crime and others think it's effective policing. And so I try and follow the evidence. And so if the evidence was to be, Keith, that, you know, having dedicated ward officers wasn't effective, then of course I'd review that.
Yeah, I don't really want to go into a long debate on this, Mr Mayor, because I think we pretty much agree, but there's just some nuances that we don't agree on. It's just a fact that having 2 per ward limits the flexibility
Sure.
of the borough commander, And I'm sure you would agree, Mr. Mayor, that not every ward in London is the same.
Well, look,
and the needs for each ward are different. And I'm just asking
Sure.
that you might consider making an aspiration for Tootle Ward, but, you know, there may be boroughs where you only need one in one ward, but you need three in
Sure.
another.
Chair, why don't I agree this? Why don't I agree to read the representations Keith Prince makes to me about which wards in his patch he wants to reduce officers in. So if you send me a list of those wards you want less than 2 officers, I'm happy to look at that.
I think, to be fair, Mr. Mayor, that was slightly mischievous of you.
No.
Putting it politely. The 1, 2, 3 structure that there was in the ward committees that were, in the wards that were introduced under the original Mayor of London was gradually changed over a period of years as a direct consequence of the Metropolitan Police requesting it, because it was draining resources and ring-fencing them in a way that they found operationally limiting. And that is a fact. Now, it is a priority of yours to put an extra police officer in every ward, and that is fine. But what Keith Prince is asking for is actually a bit more flexibility along the lines of what the Met have been asking for over the last decade.
Well, I'm happy to have a discussion with you about my recollection of history and yours. But the previous Mayor chose to get rid of 321 with his 7 priorities, the MOPAC.
Nobody's debating that it changed, Mr. Mayor, but it's the cause of the change, and we were here at the time, and you weren't. And it was because the Met Police had been coming to the Mayor saying this is restricting our operational
And that's why
response.
I appreciate how it's embarrassing for those that supported police cuts to now be faced with the consequences of those police cuts. You're right to remind me, you were here and supported Boris Johnson, Gareth.
Indeed I was.
And I'll keep on reminding you of that until he stops.
Very well,
being
Mr.
a
Mayor.
fellow
If you do that,
politician.
we will remind you that he managed to maintain funding for 32,000 police officers in spite of police cuts.
Well,
but we're going to move on, I think.
No, we're not going to move on, because you'll be aware that we're picking up the pieces of the consequence of his policy. He knew there's a black hole, cut police precept. He knew there's a black hole, refused to make the savings required to address that by planning prudently to address those shortfalls. And what's noteworthy is when I'm planning to make sure we address the black hole in the fire budget, I'm not being supported by Conservatives, because they will remember the choices they made in the last
We will come on
when
and talk about that in a
that
moment,
guy Boris
Mr.
Johnson cut fire services as well. Look, and I'm planning prudently for London's safety in fire and policing.
Interesting you just mentioned that the Mayor failed, or the previous Mayor failed to make savings. He actually made much more savings than you did. We are now going to move on, Mr. Mayor. No, Mr. Mayor, we're moving
without
on.
the criticism that you're making now when it comes to sensible decisions to
No,
reconfigure
Mr.
the
Mayor.
police estate because
We are
of the cuts
taking
made
we
by
are
central
taking a
government.
different view to your view, and we are perfectly entitled to do that. This obviously is not going to be an issue that will go away. We'll come back to it in a moment. Moving on now to talk about fire, and Assemblyman Makuba is going to lead on that.
Thanks. Just before we get into fire, Happy New Year, Mr.
Just check, do you support Boris Johnson and his cuts made over the last 8 years?
No, I didn't actually. I just want.
Pleased to hear that.
Mr. Mayor, we will focus on the issues at hand. We're talking about fire.
Actually, was one of the points I just wanted to come back to you, because in your introductory remarks, Mr. Mayor, you did say that there was not just an allowance for you to put up the council tax for the police, but also that there was an expectation that you did so. And I have a faint memory that that same expectation was applied to the previous mayor, and he actually chose not to put up council tax.
Senator Makuba, you're right to remind the chair of this committee that he supported the previous mayor when he failed to raise the police precept in the last year when he was the mayor. This chair supported the mayor as a consequence of Boris Johnson not increasing the police precept by the maximum expected of him to make. The current Home Secretary wrote to me last year and basically said she was punishing Londoners because of a decision made by Boris Johnson supported by Gareth Bacon. I decided as a consequence of the harsh letter written to me by the Home Secretary, reminding me that London was being punished because of the previous mayor's decision not to raise the police precept last year, to raise the police precept by the maximum allowed, 1.99%. Had I not done so, had I followed the actions of the previous mayor, supported by Gareth Bacon, I'd have not increased the police precept 1.99%, would have had a bigger black hole, and I would have probably been written to this year by the Home Secretary in harsh terms, criticising me and punishing Londoners. I'm not willing to have Londoners punished because of decisions I make around police precept, which is why, Senator Makuba, I've raised the maximum allowed by the government, but more importantly, the expectation the government has to raise the police precept to a maximum of £12. And I suspect, Senator Cooper, that if Boris Johnson was still the mayor, God forbid, Gareth Bacon will be supporting him in not raising the council tax by £12 and Londoners will be punished again.
Right,
Well,
so
luckily-
excuse me,
luckily,
Assembly
Mr.
Member,
Mayor,
no,
we-
excuse
we
me,
had an
Assembly Member
election.
Cooper. Given that I was name-checked 3 times in that rather lengthy answer, the fact of the matter is that the previous mayor was re-elected in 2012 on a promise to cut the precept by 10% in his term of office, which he did. A promise made, a promise kept, to use a phrase. Passing on to Assembly Member Cooper now to ask questions about fire, please.
Well, if I could address
No,
the
Mr.
point...
Mayor, you can't.
Well, I
Assembly
can.
Member Cooper. Mr. Mayor, no.
Senator Cooper, I think you're about to ask me to respond to that point.
Mr. Mayor, no. Assembly Member Cooper, questions about fire,
I
please.
think we are going to have to move on. And one of the issues about raising the precepts for the police, obviously there's the parallel amount that can be raised as well elsewhere, and that's been raised this year to 2.99%, which I think the Chief of Staff said is quite likely to be a one-off, or I think you might have said that, Mr. Mayor. And part of that you decided to put towards the fire brigade. Why have you chosen to allocate the 1.99% towards the fire brigade in 18-19? There have been some previous underspends. Is this necessary because, for example, of outcomes due to Grenfell?
Well, a number of reasons. The previous mayor, supported by Gareth Bacon, made massive cuts to the fire service. I've got a figure here which I'm entitled to answer, unless I'm ruled out of order because I'm embarrassing the chair. So in the last year for which Boris Johnson was mayor, he cut £11.5 million from the fire service. Appliances lost, firefighters lost. In 15-16, the previous mayor cut £7.4 million from the fire service. 8 fire safety inspector officers posts lost. In 14-15, the previous mayor cut £35 million from the fire service, supported by Gareth Bacon. 10 stations closed, 14 appliances lost, 552 firefighters lost. I could go on. I've got a whole list of cuts made by Boris Johnson to the fire service. A number of things are happening here. Firstly, the previous mayor's cut to the bone, supported by Conservative Assembly members who are still members of the Assembly now. We've had an awful fire at Grenfell Tower, an awful fire. The response to that fire in the tower was unforeseen by firefighters. The speed at which that fire spread through the building led me to ask the fire commissioner to go away and do a report as to what materials, tools, equipment she thinks the fire service needs. God forbid if there was another Grenfell Tower fire. I saw when I went to the site the next morning the hard-working firefighters. They had to borrow machines from Surrey, drones from Kent, but obviously the Commissioner came back with a report to me saying what she thinks the fire service needs, combination of appliances, the tool, ladders, drones, breathing apparatus, help in relation to inspection regime going forward, help with counselling and well-being, and other things that cost roughly speaking £6 to £7 million for this year. We've procured those. Roughly speaking, £5 to £6 million in subsequent years. I wrote to the Home Secretary, and she declined our request to fund that cost for this year and subsequent years. So we're using the reserves we have. We have revenue reserves. You'll be aware. So we're using some of that, some of the reserves that we have in the London Fire Service. But also you'll be aware that the revenue reserves are being spent each year to pay for the difference between income that we receive. Most of the income comes from central government. We've lost, roughly speaking, 35% from central government since 2010, 2011. So unless we took action to address the issue of Grenfell Tower, but also the difference between incomes coming in and monies going out, we'd have had a situation in 2020 where I'd be faced with making the same sort of cuts that the previous mayor happily made. I'm not willing to do that. So what I've done this year is...
Because I think the original budget that we looked at last year showed a balanced budget in the first 3 years, but in the last year it showed that there was going to be there was a gap. So this is addressing that gap in the last year, but also giving you the headroom to procure the extended breathing apparatus, the extra drones and the new drones and the extended ladders.
Absolutely, but don't forget there are still a couple of unknowns. Fire service pay increases, obviously, is an unknown, and we've got to factor that in as well. So I don't want to pretend things, it's mission accomplished for the fire service. We need to bear that in mind. Some of the things we'd hoped to do last year when I was here, day crews, alternate crewing in the light of Grenfell, it's simply not possible for us to pilot those. And so
I believe that's been
realistic.
parked now.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So some of these items would then be being purchased as revenue items, the kit, for example, rather than coming out of capital budgets. It's just that we've noticed, with looking at the revenue budget for the fire brigade, that there's been regular underspends in previous years. That's not a position that you're...
No,
and
sure.
I assume that might be something to do with recruitment, actually, because I know there's been a struggle on recruitment.
No, sure. I've not been a previous chair of LFIPA, others may have done, but I think there's a number of reasons why this has been. One has been pensions, one has been recruitment. I think, to be fair to LFIPA, they recognise this. I saw the evidence given by the fire service team last week. They take it on the chin. They think they've addressed some of these issues going forward. You can't budget for an underspend. It's just not the right way to conduct affairs. They've reassured me that for the next year, they've not budgeted for, let me rephrase this, there shouldn't be an underspend next year. We're actually recruiting the fire service now.
So as you'll know, Assembly-Member Cooper is a member of LFIPA. Their budget for 18-19 reflects the likely expected progress in recruiting and following the successful recruitment process that happened recently and everyone to happen in March, and about bringing staff levels back up to where they're budgeted to be. And so that's reflected, and clearly the brigade officers expect to deliver against that. Obviously, the Mayor's going to expect them to run efficiently through the year, and if savings are identifiable, then we absolutely should take those given the financial situation. But yeah, we're going to, the budget has been set, learning from the staffing underspend that we've seen this year, and also, previous underspends as well. Again, the brigade goes through a process of learning from that to ensure that the same things don't happen again.
Did you think of any other ways of dealing with the budget gap in that fourth year other than applying the 1.99% from the council tax? Were there any other options that could be looked at?
So if we just, there's the world before Grenfell and there's the world after Grenfell. So that the world before Grenfell, piloting day crews, piloting alternate crews, efficiency saving the fire service has to make. In the past, they've made efficiency savings, not closing down fire stations or appliances or firefighters, but efficiency savings that they can make. The world after Grenfell is very different in relation to what we're advised is the right thing to do, what is acceptable from the public, but also the various equipment the fire service needs. And I think had we had this budget and performance committee meeting earlier on this year, we'd have had a different conversation, but after Grenfell things have changed. The point to make is just, in crude terms, if you want to raise £20 million by 2020-21, you've got to start, and you're using council tax as a way of raising that money, you've got to start doing it now, otherwise you can't make it up, and you're going to make cuts in 2020-21.
So to give some more detail on that, there are basically two ways of looking at it. There's the way of saying that across the 4-year planning period that this budget represents, the brigade has a budget gap of £37.9 million, and right, how do you bridge that? And the second thing you want to try and achieve is a situation where income equals expenditure on a recurring basis, so that those two things match. That's really what you want to try to achieve. And it's true to say that the brigade has some reserves which it's able to use in 18-19 and potentially beyond. Those reserves are there in part because of underspend, but also because when we looked in detail in last year's budget process to try and identify further savings, the Mayor asked the then Commissioner to deliver those savings as aggressively as possible, because we can see that the longer term financial situation was a challenge. So that was done, and that's what built up the reserve, and that to some extent, looking at the LFIPA budget submission, the use of that in the short term masks the gap that is there and is between recurring income and recurring expenditure. So we need to try and address both problems. If one took a view that there would be no additional precept income for LFIPA and London Fire Commissioners will be in 2018-19, and then introduced a 1.99% precept rise in the following 3 years. What that would do is that would give you extra income of around £27.5 million. So that's over £10 million short of what's needed to bridge that budget gap. It also would mean in the final year, it's not just about a kind of cumulative thing over 4 years. In the final year, we will be in a situation where the income is below expenditure. It's worth noting that even with the Mayor's proposal, that will, in 21-22, there still is a gap of £1 million between income and expenditure, which one could then expect to see grow slightly in future years. So the Mayor's proposal, around 1.99% increase each year starting in 2018, doesn't address the fact that the matter entirely. And it's also worth understanding that, of course, the budget has been prepared by LFIPA on the same basis as the Met in terms of future years and a pay assumption of 1%. Again, you have to question whether that's a prudent assumption, and really it's those factors with negotiations going on. Now clear settlement hasn't been reached around 2017-18, never mind future years, that mean there is a real need to act now, notwithstanding the fact that in the short term there's a reserve that can be drawn on to smooth out income and expenditure.
Moving on to a slightly different area, we obviously saw Transport for London as well as the police and the fire brigade last week and discussed the budgets with them initially before the meeting today. And we got feedback from the Met that they will probably be reimbursed for some of the additional costs from associated with Grenfell Tower. But the fire brigade possibly not. So although they've submitted a bid to have some of the money reimbursed, it possibly doesn't meet the 750k threshold. Do we know whether they are likely to be reimbursed by DCLG for their 400k approximately costs?
So we've put in the bid, we'll be having conversations. At the moment it's official to official, and David may have an update, but it's the bid's gone in.
And what I'd say is that the government's threshold is 1%, and the sum we bid for, or can bid for, is about half that sum. So if government applies their criteria, it's unlikely, but clearly we'll be lobbying as hard as we can to ensure that full reimbursement. There is some confusion because you'll be aware that fire service was at CLG. It's now gone to the Home Office, but the government, we're working on the basis that they use old rules rather than new rules, and so I've not written off the possibility that the Home Office may reimburse the amounts of money that was spent over and above what normally be expected for a fire.
It's the point of it essentially being a local authority, and that's a local authority matter, hence why it's submitted through David's team to DCLG, and we need to, that went in between Christmas and New Year, so now give them time to look at it, and then we need to follow up and see what we can do.
Okay, and then finally, the issue about the thorny issue, as it's turned out to be, of the sale of the HQ building overlooking the River Thames, which is the most amazing building and obviously completely unique, with a museum in one corner and all sorts of incredible features. Now, we've not managed to sell it yet. What progress is it possible to make, and is this something, Mr. Mayor, that you think that you could potentially help with in terms of moving that sale along?
Well, I'll ask David to come in a moment because he's on top of the details of 8 Albert Embankment. I think my understanding is that there is a planning application due to be submitted, development agreement due to be agreed. Just what we're allowed to say publicly and what.
So back in March 2016, a company called U&I were chosen following a full procurement process to redevelop the site. And they've been working on plans ready to submit the planning application to London Borough of Lambeth. And so that work is ongoing. Obviously, there are one or two matters still that they're addressing. Affordable housing, obviously, is a very significant consideration. That work is currently being done, and so we're hopeful that will lead to a submission to Lambeth fairly imminently around planning permission. Of course, this receipt, because because A, planning permission hasn't been granted, and B, because the timing of development and income receipts is uncertain, LFIPA haven't made any assumption in their budget about when any receipt would be forthcoming. So as and when that happens, it's all upside, which will help with future capital activity.
Well, yes, because that was one of the features of the budget that we noticed, that they're anticipating looking at borrowing and also PFI leases, which of course have somewhat come into disrepute because of their latter year costs. So if the sale proceeds in a timely fashion, the planning permission is obtained and then the sale goes ahead, would that obviate the need for borrowing stroke PFI leases, or would that still be required?
Well, I believe the PFI leases already exist around new station development, so that those deals are what they are. Clearly, there's a question about what the quantum would be in terms of the contribution. I don't have a likely figure for that in front of me, but clearly we would look about how best to apply that against the capital programme in preference to borrowing if that were the prudent course to take.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, on the final thing about Albert and Bank, I sincerely wish you luck. It's been a thorny issue for nearly a decade now. They got very close a few years ago, and a planning permission had gone through, but there was a lot of local opposition, and it had to be pulled. And this is the umpteenth time to do this. So for members' benefit, it's entirely prudent for FIPA not to have that in their budget at the moment, because it's not a sure thing. Although we wish it fair sailing.
No, the building is such a challenge, I would say, to develop.
It is. It's very difficult, and I sincerely hope to go through. On the Bellwyn scheme, Mr. Galley, just to pick that up, the 1% rule that you have correctly alluded to, that the DCLG are applying on that, is of course the same 1% rule that the Home Office are applying to the special police grants. And what we heard and were very encouraged by last week is that the Home Office may be looking at that very flexibly, i.e. Setting it aside for the moment. And what we were hoping is that we would in some way link, I appreciate it's two different government departments, but it's still the government, might advise the DCLG of the flexibility being shown by the Home Office and perhaps use that as leverage on them. Have we done that in our bid? Or are those conversations going on?
It's probably better if I wouldn't discuss this in public at this point, but obviously we're doing everything we can to maximise our claims. But it's probably better to keep those conversations out in the private moment.
That was very careful again, well done. Right, so moving on, and we're going to talk about transport now, and Assemblymember Pigeon is leading on this.
So thank you very much. This is probably the most challenging year I've seen in terms of Transport for London's budget. You've got, in some areas, falling passenger numbers, which we haven't predicted. You've had to revise your fare revenue predictions. We've seen some of the rolling stock plans cancelled for the Northern Line, Jubilee Line. Boroughs have got cuts coming up as well to their LIP funding. Does this show that TfL is really in a financially difficult position?
I don't accept some of the premises in your question about cuts, but it's tough. Look, we are the only major public transport body in Europe not subsidised by central government. I mean, it's just astonishing. I know people get upset when I criticise the previous mayor, but the previous mayor agreed to deal with the government to get rid of our operation grant altogether. It just beggars belief, supported by Assembly members. It's astonishing. So we're going to lose £700 million a year, roughly speaking, from central government. But I want to move from a situation where we're in deficit, breaking even, to being in surplus. And, we have made massive savings across the TfL organisation. For the first time since its inception, operating costs have gone down, £153 million saved in first full year. More savings can be made in relation to viable engineering, in relation to merging of engineering, in relation to making sure we have fewer estates rather than having all these buildings across London. But it's going to be tough for the reasons you alluded to. It wasn't predicted for there to be passenger numbers going down on the Underground. The good news is nobody predicted it across the country. So you look at the National Rail, the passenger usage has also gone down, more so actually than the Underground. The good news is this year, the central part of Elizabeth Line will open up. That will hopefully increase footfall in relation to the Underground, reconfiguring in particular in Outer London how we use buses, moving from central to Outer London as well. But you know, who would have predicted 4 terror attacks leading to firstly 4 terror attacks, then obviously the impact that had in relation to the leisure visits to London, the impact that had in relation to the number of discretionary users of public transport we usually expect in the summer. So we factor that in for next year, bearing in mind the concerns you've articulated, but I'm confident that TfL will do well next year.
So you're confident that the figures that you base the budget on stack up for the next year in terms of passenger numbers and your fare revenue?
The phrase used by the Commissioner, who I admire, was he called it a blip in relation to, in 20 years, say for 2008, the first time there's been this blip. You know, we're hoping Brexit doesn't have a negative impact in relation to people using public transport. We're hoping that the leisure visitors return. If you speak to those in charge of leisure facilities within London, they notice a reduction of the sort of people within this country making the day trips to London. The good news is tourist numbers still held up, which is very good. And so I'm quite confident we'll meet the targets TfL has. And they've been, the tyres have been kicked in relation to giving them the scrutiny they deserve.
Certainly, it's fair to say that in this business plan, TfL have recognised that clearly the path that fares income has taken in really since last summer has deviated from what was expected previously, and therefore they've, you know, there are risks for various factors, as the Mayor articulated. There are others that I know the Deputy Mayor spoke to you about last week, and therefore in putting together this business plan, which then feeds through into the budget, TfL have been prudent and cautious in their assumptions of revenue, largely based around assumptions around the path London and the UK's economy will take. Because it's better to do that and have upside than clearly not do that and have downside.
Just two things. We've used the Office for Budget Responsibilities assumptions around growth. So if TfL's predictions don't turn out as they should do, then the government's got problems as well, because the OBRs, the figures that we use for growth, number one. Number two, you mentioned Northern and Jubilee. That's a pause for very good reasons, which I'm happy to talk about, for which we should get credit, rather than being caricatured as a cut. You'll be aware of the huge investment taking place in Circle District, Hampstead City, Metropolitan, Piccadilly, Bakerloo, Central, Waterloo and City, the Overground. And there's a very good reason why we've paused at Northern and Jubilee, which I can come to if you want me to.
Yeah, I mean, I'll come on to that, but we've had it confirmed at committee that the actual new rolling stock has been cancelled, not paused. The overall programme was paused, but that element was cancelled. We had that.
For a very good reason.
Yeah, we've had those, but I'm just saying that there's big decisions you've had to make, which are financial, and it's just, I don't think TfL's ever been under this pressure before. That's why I was trying to highlight a variety of things.
There's a phrase, isn't there, that I've heard the Mayor use before, good but flabby, and really what we're seeing is...
He means TfL, not me.
Yeah, 19, 20 months of hard graft in terms of their transformation programme to try and address that. And clearly there's much more that we've got to do following the withdrawal of the operating grant, and we have to recognise that takes away one of the variables that TfL has in its budget, and there is thus as a percentage much more exposure to the economy and what happens there, and so we have to work on that basis.
Before I get into some other specifics, just in terms of the passenger numbers and all that predictions, and it's about different lifestyles, and there has been evidence that more and more people do work at home a day a week if they're able to. Obviously not all jobs you can do that, but is there some work going on with the TfL, or whether it's a GLA economics or elsewhere, to really try to get to the bottom of this? Because you can have predictions, but if people now work or live their lives in a different way, it will have a knock-on impact in terms of your revenue and passenger numbers.
Well, I mean, this is a science, and so I think Mike Brown's made an offer to talk you through some of the science involved in the forecasting. And the point I'd make is actually I think there's a 2% inverted commas margin of error, which ain't bad in relation to forecasting something so difficult as passenger numbers. But you're right to remind me, as indeed the Deputy Mayor for Transport regularly reminds me, that people's lifestyles have changed. Working from home, watching The Crown on Netflix rather than going to the cinema. People who use different forms of public transport, and that's why reconfiguring buses to Outer London is so important. By the way, the good news is you've got a public transport body that is encouraging people to walk and cycle, which you'd sort of argue doesn't make business sense on the one hand, because you're encouraging custom to leave you. But it's because we're more joined up in relation to recognising as a city we want people to be walking and cycling much more and using public transport than they previously have.
Okay, thank you. Let's get into some of the other specifics. One of the issues is the LIP funding, the borough funding, is reducing by 22% to boroughs. Why are you doing this, particularly when they're so important to delivering this healthy streets agenda that you've just touched on?
I'm not sure about the percentage figures. I'd agree with that.
It goes from 223 million in 2017-18 to 174 million in 2018-19. That's where the 22% comes from.
And then builds back up again, successive years, 203 million, 217 million, 208 million, 197. So there's clearly a part of that is going to be a project factor which will cause some of that variance. It's clearly that the investment there is at very significant levels compared to what it was in the past, and the Mayor's trying to maintain that as much as possible. But given the removal of the operating grant and the fact that therefore TfL has to find money to fund roads itself, there's a need need to be a bit tighter on that than we had hoped to be. I mean,
the figures I have, Caroline, are in 2013, 134. We're giving 16-17, 206, 17-18, 204. There's a dip 18-19, 174. Then it goes back up to 203 in 1920, 217, 2021. On top of that, I've maintained the current record levels of investment in borough roads. As you'll know, boroughs control 95% of the capital's road network, £101 million. So we are spending huge amounts in local implementation plans in the context of us losing £700 million a year from central government. So I'm quite pleased with that. These are record sums, but also we've got to bear in mind that actually the government is punishing Londoners by not giving us the amount of money we should get from vehicle excise duty. We've reached this perverse situation where we are car drivers in London subsidising the maintenance of roads outside of London, not within London, but also public transport users having to pay for roads inside London. That can't be right.
So how will the condition of London's roads be affected by reduced spending on maintenance and renewals, which is in your budget? And perhaps you could outline a bit more about your negotiations with government to try to get a share of vehicle excise duty.
As a consequence of this government's policies, as a consequence of the last budget in particular, less money was spent on London's roads to maintain them. We can't run away from that. In the short to medium term, TfL will have to significantly reduce their programme of proactive capital renewals in the road network. will also, of course, make sure the safety of the network is maintained. But it's just worth getting on top of these figures. London will not receive any of the allocation from the new roads fund. £500 million of that money is raised from vehicle excise duty paid for by Londoners. And the net operating cost of London's roads, which is currently £200 million a year, renewing these roads between £100 to £150 million a year is being cross-subsidised from the fare-paying public transport users. The last time I met with the Secretary for Transport, Chris Grayling, I made these points to him. He was sympathetic. He was sympathetic to the needs of Londoners and road users. He would argue, if he was here, it's a Treasury decision. And so we're going to continue to lobby the Treasury. in relation to making sure that we get the monies that we need. And by the way, this is on top of you'll be subsidising the air quality fund for the rest of the country, when we know 40% of the most polluting roads are in London. So again, London road users are helping to subsidise the cost of cleaning up the air around the country, not getting any help from central government for London. And this is why I say this government is the most anti-London government in my memory.
Okay. Thank you for that. Let's move on to buses. The bus usage in London is decreasing. You're also planning in your budget to reduce the number of kilometres buses travel. You're reducing the frequency of buses on many, many bus routes. Just in some mayor's answers out yesterday, routes 36, 53, 484, W12, right across London, you're taking out buses on bus routes. How realistic is it that you are forecasting that you're going to see an increase in bus fare revenue when there are actually some reductions in bus services? Well,
firstly, I don't accept all the various caveats in your question, but let me just tell you in short form. So firstly, I don't accept that there being less mileage, using your phrase, leads to less passenger numbers. I think by sensible use of buses, you can increase passenger numbers, although in the short term, kilometres are being reduced. I think a number of factors you've not highlighted in your various caveated question. For example, the Elizabeth line starting this year will have a huge impact in relation to bus usage in central London. The pedestrianisation of Oxford Street will have a big impact. Moving buses from central London to out London has a big impact. If there are any particular buses you've got issues with, we'll look into those. Some of those is because demand has fallen away. We've all received complaints from Londoners about seeing empty buses going down the roads with nobody in them. We're seeking to address some of that, making sure we move those buses to where they needed the most. As far as kilometre usage is concerned, you'll be aware in the final year there is actually an increase in kilometre usage for the reasons I've said, central London moving to outer London. One of the reasons, by the way, people are using buses less is the lack of confidence they can get from A to B in the time promised. And that's why we're doing work around digging up roads properly, with some common sense taking place with utilities, with the permit scheme, priority traffic lights. And Leonie Cooper is a big fan of these in relation to the difference they've made in relation to speeding buses through, so you have more confidence. So it's not all bad news as you sort of characterise in your question. I think a lot of it is good news.
But you're predicting an increase in bus fare revenue when you are taking buses out of routes for all the reasons you said, and we know, you're taking a huge amount. I think it was 60 million, I think, came up at a previous meeting, taking out of the bus contracts in order to balance your books as well. Is it realistic to say you're going to have an increase in bus fare revenue when you are reducing buses on the roads?
Just because you're not criticising me for making the franchises work harder for less money, I'm sure. But I don't apologise for getting more value for money from the contractors.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, we know you're reducing the frequency of buses on routes, so people will be waiting longer for buses, and you could have a situation where people then give up on buses because actually having to wait half an hour rather than 20 minutes or 15 minutes. And what I don't want to see is a spiralling sort of back to the days where people didn't use buses. It's been a huge success since 2000, the investment in buses, and I want to make sure that continues.
As indeed we do. And you'll have seen what the Commissioner said last week in relation to how the future of buses is quite optimistic. A lot of us now use apps in relation to, rather than waiting, as you say, in the example you gave, 15 minutes for a bus, we're waiting to leave home. So we know the bus is going to be nearby before we do that. We plan our journeys. The hopper fare has led to more and more people switching over buses because they know they can do it for free with unlimited bus travel within an hour, and tram is included. You'll see more change in behaviour from users. And the other thing about bus usage is you can use a bus but also walk at the same time as well, as part of your journey from home to work or home to leisure and stuff. So, you know, it is challenging in relation to the cuts made from central government that we've talked about, but actually I'm optimistic about bus usage, and I think it's a bit crude to equate kilometres versus passenger usage. You're right in the short term, because of the reconfiguration, there is a few buses in central London. There'll be more in outer London as we move forward. And our population is growing. Each year, roughly speaking, 100,000 more Londoners, and so by definition, they'll need to use public transport more.
Are you confident that the figures in your budget that show an increase in bus fare revenue will actually materialise? You've got confidence in those figures, given all these changes to the network?
It's going to be challenging, but I think the TfL have looked at what happened last year and the year before, and hoping to have figures that are accurate.
Okay, let's move on. In terms of capital, in your budget, draft budget, you say you're investing record amounts in modernising our transport infrastructure. TfL's capital spend is actually going to fall over the next 4 years. I've taken out the Crossrail element, but for this year it's forecast 2.14, then goes to 2.01, and by the end of 21-22, 1.86 million. Can you explain that to us, please?
And this is another reason where I think the TfL should be commended, and the Deputy Mayor for Transport, for value for money, improved efficiencies, savings, value engineering, retiming the way payments work to make sure we get more for less. If you look at some of the things that we're working on, healthy streets and healthy people, healthy streets portfolio, opening the Elizabeth line, 4 lines modernisation programme, deep tube programme, the extension of Gospel Oak to Barking line, making sure we use surplus land for genuinely affordable homes. A lot of this has been done by making sure we make the contractors do more for less. Roughly speaking, 85%, I think, one of the Davies will correct me, 85% of the monies TfL spends on subcontractors. And we've got to make sure that we get more out of them. So I don't apologise for merging engineering. I don't apologise for saying we should think about when we pay contractors. Why not pay on delivery rather than pay in advance? I don't apologise for saying if we look after our assets, they can last longer. I'll give you an example. If you have a car and you maintain it regularly, invest in your car, you don't need to replace it after 3 years. You can make it last much longer. So I'm not apologising for us investing record amounts, but getting value for money for the taxpayer in the private sector.
Is that why capital's reduced?
So could I, just in terms of the bold numbers, it's also worth noting that there are some things that, from a big picture perspective, one would regard as capital expenditure, for instance around borough roads, which actually TfL class as operating expenditure in terms of their accounts and how they treat it, even though that money goes out to boroughs who regard it as capital expenditure. So it's another reason why you need to think a little bit more about what the deliverables actually are on the ground, rather than the capital number within the budget.
Okay, but it is going down slightly over the next few years. That's correct? The capital... The
programme or the money spent, because I'm looking at the programme. So the capital programme is the most ambitious ever at a time we're reducing operating costs. If you're criticising me for getting more value for the money we spend, then... I'm
trying to get my head around the figures, to be honest. You're saying you want to do an awful lot, and I'm just... your budget's going down, so is it deliverable within that budget?
I can't move upside down.
Is it, yes?
Yeah.
these
Correct.
programmes can be delivered within that budget and it is going down slightly.
I mean, there's a slight reduction after allowing for the Crossrail spend being taken out on the overall level of annual TfL capital programme, but broadly speaking, it's at a similar level to previous years once you allow for Crossrail, although it's a marginal reduction, as you say.
Let me move on to Crossrail 2. We really would like to understand the case you've made to government on how you can fund your half over the course of the build programme. Are you able to publish that information so that we can understand how TfL and yourselves could fund half of Crossrail 2?
Well, mine, when I last met Chris Grayling, we agreed on an independent funding and finance review to address actually your point, because his question is phrased differently and as courteously as you, by the way, is we need to make sure the numbers stack up, which is not unreasonable. Just to remind you, the previous deal was to pay half the cost, but not in real time. The government said you've got to pay half the cost during construction. TfL worked incredibly hard to try and get there. We have Crossrail 2, as was envisaged, may be slightly different to Crossrail 2 as it comes out in relation to some of the scoping, but that's exactly what the independent funding and finance review is doing, and I'm sure we could share that with the Assembly once that review's been undertaken.
Saying some of the scoping might be different, does that mean it may not be the full route?
No, it will be the full route, but I mean, for example, phasing is
phasing. Okay, so I thought you meant you were descoping some of the stations or something. But when do we expect that we might be able to see that work?
Well, I'm hoping that I'm not sure which one's the budget, which one's the statement, but in this spring statement, there should be good news in relation to this. The DfT, as we speak, I think, is starting work on the independent review.
I believe they've identified the individual who's going to conduct it, which I think is a positive appointment. Obviously, I have to see whether he gets in there in time for anything material to be said in the spring statement, or whether he needs a bit longer, and then we'll be able to deal with that. What the Mayor has done is demonstrated that there is a way in which half the cost during construction can be met by London, and the purpose behind that is not to say this is the way it absolutely must be done. There are various factors to think about, and I know the Crossrail 2 team continue reviewing costs and looking at ways whether things can be done more efficiently, consistent with the rest of TfL's attitude. And so all that will play out. But what was important was that we demonstrate that the government's challenge. There are ways to meet it. It's the timetable gives a little bit of time before the funding mechanisms have to be locked down. So let's not in 2017 go, well, actually there's a fundamental problem here. There absolutely isn't. Let's continue to do this work and refine it through the funding and finance review, refine it through what the Crossrail 2 team are doing, and then that should get us towards the best package that we can put forward.
Okay, thank you. We look forward to hearing more on that in due course. Finally, rail devolution is something you've been pushing the government for. If there was a change of heart, looking at your budget, would TfL actually be able to afford to improve some of London's suburban rail services, given that's been part of the success of London Overground?
My understanding from conversations with the Secretary of State is that's off the table, so we're not spending any more time on this.
Okay. But if there's a change of heart, or are you just saying well, it's off the table, we're leaving it now?
Well, if the government did another U-turn, so that'd be sort of 360 in total, then of course we'd speak to them and stuff, because Londoners are getting a huge disservice from southern, southeast and southwestern. So because Londoners and our economy could do with a better service, we'd look at it again, of course. I'm not going to be churlish and sort of say we've walked away now, but it's for the government to change their mind.
There's no money allocated to
So,
cover it.
so what we've seen, obviously, where the overground has come in, is significant increases in riders, and that obviously brings fare income. And so, what that, in general terms, allows you to consider is to say, well, is there a case to borrow to invest because we know we'll get the money back through fare increases? So if the government was to do a significant U-turn and devolve a metro service for Southern or South East or something like that, then absolutely the work that TfL did would be dusted down, and we'd see whether we needed, whether borrowing was appropriate or whether there were other avenues. So we absolutely would look at that, while the government isn't changing its position on devolution overall. There are questions about whether there are one or two individual services as they review franchises, and so those discussions will carry on at official level as potential options that continue to demonstrate our willingness to take on rail devolution and deliver a better service for Londoners.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Assembly Member Prince, but no other members at this stage. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you, Chair. Just to drag you back to buses, the second phase of Hopper, which is what originally you wanted to deliver, which is as many changes you like within the hour, that's the mayoral promise which you have delivered on, and I understand because of technical reasons you weren't able to deliver that in the first place. The only thing with, let's call it phase 2, is that will have a significant impact on bus revenues, because whilst somebody may use 2 buses in an hour, at the end of the day, when you take into account the return journey, the cap is at £4.50, whereas if it's unlimited use within an hour, most people travel to work within the hour, you're now really allowing them to travel to and from work for £3. Not criticising that, by the way, but that will have a significant impact on revenues. And could you tell me, one, what impact you think this will have now on revenues, and two, has that been fully accounted for in the concerns expressed by Assemblymember Pigeon in relation to the fact that we're looking at an increase in bus revenues?
Well, firstly, let me remind you how we got here. So the promise was to have unlimited bus travel within an hour within my first term. That ends in April 2020. Within the first year, we began the Hopper fare, which is 2 for 1 within an hour. And many people, I think 140 million journeys made on the Hopper 2 for 1. By the end of January, so within the first 20 months, we'll have, so not April 2020, within the first 20 months, we'll have unlimited bus travel and tram travel within an hour. Promise made, promise delivered. We think the Hopper 2 for 1, roughly speaking, is £30 million a year, and we think the unlimited bus and tram travel within an hour is £35 million a year, roughly speaking. So an additional £5 million for the unlimited within an hour.
Do you think that's realistic?
We do, because the outturn of around £30 million outturn the Mayor talked about is very close to the budgeted, the forecast that TfL made, which gives us confidence that their modelling around this is accurate.
Okay, I feel that's a bit low, but fine, that's your figure.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, the next section is the LDDC. I think it's over to Amish Desai.
Okay, Chair. Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor. The LLDC's financial problems are well documented. How does this affect the finances of the rest of the GLA group?
Thanks for your question. I suspect everyone here besides me is a West Ham fan, so let me just...
yeah, come on, you Iron.
And Leone, of course. So I think that a number of things are happening around the LLDC, which I think we should be encouraged by. We've got a very good chair. We had a very good chief exec leaving, a new one beginning shortly. We had the Moore Stevens report. We have now a clear, streamlined management in relation to what happens with the stadium. As you're aware, Newham are no longer part of the agreement, which means we can streamline what happens there. We've got a very good chief restructuring officer who's appointed and working with us. We've managed to make savings and increase revenues in some areas. For example, next year we're going to reduce the seating costs from, roughly speaking, 12 million spent last year to 4 million this year. The commercial returns have gone up, and we've reduced operational costs. We've also now capped the amount we borrow, the amount we lend to NLDC, roughly speaking, £520 million. We're also working on some joint ventures, but also, being frank, direct granting of some of the projects around NLDC. So look, I'm optimistic about the future, but I just make this small point, which is, I think we shouldn't look at NLDC just through the prism of this budget. I think the social and economic benefits to that part of London, which you're well aware of, Unmesh, from being an East Londoner, have been humongous. And the original vision, if you remember, that the first mayor had, Ken Livingstone, when he bid for the Olympics, was to use the Olympics as a way to regenerate that part of London. And I think it's been huge economic and social benefits to that part of London.
I mean, you talked about the challenges and the work that you're already doing, and now that the change of ownership of the stadium, with LLC now owning 100% of. But, I mean, can you be more specific, or you might want to come in, David, here, about the impact on the rest of the GLA family and the finances of the rest of the GLA family? Are there any implications?
No, because what we've been able to do is, as you say, cap the amount that LLDC borrows at a prudent level, and then some additional money it needs. There was a provision that already existed, which we've been able to take advantage of and redirect that, so we could do that. And then in terms of the joint ventures on the housing side of things that the GLA will do, we have resources coming free within GLAP, our commercial London property arm, which enable us to meet that.
Okay, how did you been asking this question a few months ago? I can understand the concern, because obviously seating costs go through the roof. How much it costs each year to change this from a football stadium to a sporting/cultural event. There is a view this was a money pit in relation to the GLA families you referred to and stuff, but I'm reassured by the Moore Stevens report, by the work the Chief Restructuring Officer is doing, by the work Peter Henley's already done. Joey's done a great job, the new Chief Exec begins, that I'm more confident now about reducing the amount that we subsidise, if you like, NLDC, but also how we reduce revenue overspends, but also how we find the monies to invest in capital.
Okay. If I can turn to three specific areas. On one hand, Mr. Mayor, you've got the very desirable objective of increasing the level of affordable housing across the site to 50%. But then there's also the issue of raising money through the fixed estate charge. Reducing the level of affordable housing would actually increase the fixed estate charge income. How do you reconcile the two objectives?
I'm a firm advocate of genuinely affordable homes Londoners can afford to live in, and so rather than selling off an asset for a one-off windfall, I'd rather use the asset to build the genuinely affordable homes we need. And so, I don't hide from having a strategic target of 50% affordable homes. You're right, though. There is a cost to that, because obviously we'd make more money if we sold for homes unaffordable to local residents and unaffordable to most Londoners. Some of the deals were agreed previously. I'm not changing some of those deals because contracts were exchanged. There's an expectation and all the rest of it. And we're working on some joint ventures going forward, though. So you can separate, if you like, Chobham Manor, Eastwick and Sweetwater. They remain in place, given the progress made on those projects. We're keeping the old targets in relation to affordable housing. As David said, the GLA housing team, GLAP, are working with NLDC in relation to some joint ventures going forward in relation to meeting my aim of having 50% affordable homes. Obviously, there's other things like Pudding Pudding Mill Lane, and one or two others we can talk about if you want to, which I've got a briefing for. But it's a combination of where there's deals and agreements made, sticking with those, where we can, making sure that those homes which have not had agreements in, we can have 50% affordable homes, at the same time making sure that the cultural education district happens.
And of course, in terms of the fixed estate charge is very important, but it's important also to think about, as I think Martin outlined last week, the additional business rates and council tax income that is being generated for the local boroughs and for ourselves receiving a share of that. So we're £58 million up on 8 years ago. By the mid-2020s, we'll be up £150 million, we forecast, and by the mid-2030s, £200 million. And so there is real kind of public sector revenue generation coming from this project. It's not just about the fixed estate charge.
Okay. Talking about joint ventures, what are the main opportunities and risks from the GLA being the partner in joint venture developments rather than LLDC? And does this have an impact elsewhere for the GLA budget?
So it makes very little kind of practical difference whether LLDC or GLA fundamentally is the partner, in that the GLA stands behind the LLDC's finances in any case. So it's not really an issue from that perspective. It's just about making best use of the finance available within GLAP, and what the work is now going on to say, okay, right, what's the detail of how these joint ventures will actually run? To what extent will Housing and Land Team involved? To what extent will LDC colleagues be involved? How do we best do that? We won't look to come to a view on that finally until the new LDC chief executive starts and gets her feet under the table, in order that she's got an opportunity to input into that. We expect her start date's mid-February, and so we'll look to come to a conclusion. Just
to finish that off on Mesh, without prejudice to what the new chief executive may well say, the aspiration is to get homes for Londoners involved in some of this housing, because the expertise is there, and it'd be silly not to use it.
There's a general point, as we've seen with OPDC, about more collaboration around the group. Obviously, TfL property moving in at Union Street, and trying to get, ensuring that we don't have different teams scattered around London doing the same thing.
Okay, just moving on. The well-documented problems again caused by the Olympic Stadium design. So, bearing in mind that the Cultural Education District project has its own sort of complications and it's a complex project, what are you doing to ensure that it is set up appropriately and does not present the GLA with a further risk to its budget?
That's a very, very good question. So we sought advice and expertise from the Bloomberg Group to give us Bloomberg to advise us on management as we go forward with the CED, the governance. Because you're right, what we don't want to do is either create a bureaucracy or a liability. And so Bloomberg Philanthropy are advising us on what is the right governance for the cultural education district. You'll be aware some of the partners entering into agreement is very exciting. And so we're working with Bloomberg to get the right governance structures in place, because obviously we want to make sure that the cultural education district has on board in a governance role some of those key people there, without us worrying about it being managed from City Hall with expertise.
In addition, Peter Hendy is working on the refresh of the board at LLDC as members there come to the end of their term of office, and ensuring that we've got the right kind of cultural collaboration skills on the board is something that he's very much thinking about.
Just a couple more questions, Chair, if I may. The issue of naming rights for the stadium. We were told 3 times last year. I think sometime January this time last year, sometime over summer, and as recently as November, that, and I quote, LLDC were, quote, very confident of securing a sponsor. What's your take on this, Mr. Mayor?
A combination of streamlining now who's responsible, but also the chief restructuring officer means I think we're closer than we have in the past been to resolving this. It is difficult. Why is it difficult? Because the optimum time to get the maximum revenues for naming rights would have been after the Olympics, before West Ham moved in. I'm not criticising West Ham or their brand, but at the obvious time when you'd maximised monies for naming rights. For a variety of reasons, we're going to rehearse the previous regime, it didn't happen. And so where we are. I think streamlining processes, but also the work the Chief Restructuring Officer is doing, including some advanced Sherpa work, I mean, there's more chance of that happening and us making some much needed monies rather than less chance.
So what's really important is that we got very close twice. What's really important is that we re-enter the market with the right commercial strategy and the right message that gives us the best chance of success. That's why the Chief Restructuring Officer is undertaking an exercise at the moment, working with stadium partners to be clear on what the vision for the stadium is, so that we've got a message. And obviously that involves working closely with West Ham as key tenants at the stadium to try and ensure we've got the right message that will go to market.
One more question, Chair. You talked, I think it was you, Mr. Mayor, about commercial income going up, and we also told under your draft capital spending plans and borrowing limits that a number of work streams are in train to reduce costs and increase income in order to minimize the public subsidy. I'm more interested in the income side of things. So what are these work streams?
To do the stadium?
Well, yes.
So I'd say a little bit on the stadium. So we've talked previously about seating costs and how in 2018 that will be about £4 million compared to 12 million in 2017. That's based around the type of events that are going to be held in 2018. And clearly discussions are going on about future years, as Peter Hendy said to you last week. And also the work is ongoing still, looking at options for changing the seating, potentially to make it quicker and cheaper to transition. And we've talked about that before. What we're also seeing is We've gained some rugby matches. I think we've got Saracens rugby match happening that has been at Wembley in previous years. So from the income generating side, we're trying to bring in events, and we're trying to ensure that happens. Not in we're doing that on a commercial basis, given the situation the stadium's in, and then also on the expenditure side, we're looking at, the Chief Restructuring Officer is looking at another number of commercial deals. The improvements he's already secured there are equivalent to about £870,000 a year of additional income. So that's real progress. Partly advertising, partly other commercial rights around the stadium. So there is progress happening there. What we also have allowed in the budget is some spend to save, where we think we can reduce ongoing operational costs. We've identified that we can save around 40% of utility costs. That's around £750,000 a year through spend to save initiatives. And that includes things like changing the lighting at the stadium to LED lighting. So those are not savings that have been secured yet, but that gives you an indication of the work that is ongoing. So while there is the kind of big picture about the vision for the stadium, and all of that plays into the discussions about with partners who use it, that's not in parallel for that, the savings are being looked for, so we can start addressing the situation.
I should of course add that the slide is now bringing in some money as well.
Yeah, if you look outside the stadium.
Have you been on it yet?
Experienced too.
Have you been there? Did you?
I've not been on it.
On the opening day, twice.
Twice. Is there photographic evidence?
There might be, but I don't like to talk about that.
Transparency.
A couple of tidying up questions, then I'm going to go to Assembly Member Berry. You mentioned Bloomberg have been brought in to do some work on the Cultural and Education District.
Governance, the Bloomberg Philanthropy is an arm of Bloomberg, but help with the advice on governance of CED.
Yeah, that wasn't something we'd picked up before. Is that going to be public? Can it be published?
There will be a report, I'm sure, that last I heard that was it was in draft and it was being discussed with partners. Clearly, there will be, we will need to publish and explain the governance structure that is in place. Briefly, what we're trying to ensure is that it's really important that the CED is more than the sum of its parts. Yeah, we don't just want a situation where we have lots of great institutions in their own building doing their own things. Part of what makes it really exciting is the collaboration, the cross-fertilisation of ideas. And it's important also that it's not just about the institutions on the waterfront and UCL a small distance away. It's about, you've got other universities, you've got other cultural organisations, for instance, Wayne McGregor in here east, and you've got other cultural institutions in the area, a lot of creative industries out at Hackney Wick, you've got the Theatre Royal in Stratford, you have other things, a lot of things going on in the area. And what we're going to try and ensure is that we don't just have LLDC doing a very effective job on physically building the CED, but also that we get that creative collaboration and that we're not just thinking about this, we built the buildings, job done. We're thinking about this very much, for the future and how that partnership keeps growing and we get the best of the opportunity. And that's what this is really about.
Okay. One question on the stadium. The Moore Stevens review was published around about a month ago now, obviously by Christmas in between. Mr Mayor, have you or has anyone in your office or indeed the LLDC made contact with Baroness Brady, who I understand is in day-to-day control of West Ham United, to discuss the review and the next steps forward?
I think our officers have been in touch,
there should be a meeting. I don't know if the date's been set and it's gone in the Mayor's diary, but a date is going in the Mayor's diary for to meet. I've spoken to Baroness.
To meet with her?
Yes, to meet with Baroness Brady. I spoke with Baroness Brady personally last when the report was published. We had a positive conversation then, and I know obviously that LLDC have been in contact as one would expect.
I think it's worth, just to be fair to West Ham, disentangle the litigation which is on from the consensual approach taken by West Ham, aside from litigation, to the report and stuff, which bodes well, and so.
Yeah.
Okay.
I want you to think the litigation means we're not talking to them.
I absolutely don't want to think that because clearly they're partner workers and they've got to be part of the solution. And if that were to be so, then that would be an act of self-harm. Assembly Member Berry.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask David for a bit of clarification on something you said earlier about the borrowing cap, because obviously that's a new thing that's in this budget. The borrowing was going to go up for LLDC above 800 million. GLA's capped it at 520 million, and I think you said earlier this is a provision that already existed we were able to use. Can you explain a bit more about that and where the money's coming from?
I can do, if I find the right page so I do it accurately. There's a provision in the GLA budget for repayment of debt. That provision has been there and existed. It hasn't been needed for the purposes it was originally created, and so instead we've repurposed that to be able to use it for LLDC. So that's not, to be clear, that's not taking us all the way up to the full 800 and odd million pounds that you talked about. That's where the joint ventures come into play, but it is taking us up to about the 590 million mark.
So in fact we're actually, because this is grant money, isn't it? Otherwise, if you were expecting it back, that would take away the point of reducing the borrowing. This is essentially a grant of, you said, around about 70 million.
So it's at 14.9 million in 18-19, then 12.8 million, then each of the next 2 years 11.8 million.
And presumably that can carry on for a few more years after that and go up.
We obviously
Okay.
we have to, each year we shift forward and we look at the kind of new year 4 and work out what the factors are.
The question I don't think you answered is there an opportunity? Could this have been used for something else? Is there an opportunity cost to the GLA of doing this for the LLDC?
Well, obviously, resources at the Mayor's disposal, the Mayor can choose how to allocate. Clearly, the choice is about the 3 big strategic things that the LLDC is doing. Number 1, sorting out the finances of the stadium, which we are in any case committed to by contracts entered previously. So we always were liable for a large part of that, and we're trying to address that. The Culture and Education District, and then the housing developments and affordable housing. Those are the kind of the 3 big things LLDC is trying to achieve, and so obviously it's the decision of the Mayor to support those projects.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're going to move on to the next section, which is the Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation, and Assemblymember Duval is leading it.
In our previous budgetary hearings, we heard evidence that the Old Oak and Park Royal had submitted a bid for the Housing Infrastructure Fund, and they're likely to hear very shortly whether they're going to be shortlisted, and of course the decision would be later on this year, the final decision. In view of that, what do we need to make, if we are successful with that, any changes to the budget, if that's the case, in terms of securing whatever funds they may receive?
It depends very much, I think, on what the outcome is, because this is not as I understand the HIF process, an all or nothing, where you either get everything you asked for or nothing at all. And the process, clearly there's a process of, if you're, as you say, shortlisted, then producing a more detailed, I think it was described as treasury-proof business case to try and do that. It's important to understand that some of HIF money can be used on, if you like, operational matters and how you have the ability to spend the bulk of the money. So it's not a case that the money you get has to be entirely capital funding, and then you're going, oh right, we need funding to work out how to do that. So if we get shortlisted and then we do the more detailed work to refine the bid, that's when we need to identify in more detail whether it's staff or whether it's consultants, as OPDC talked about last week, what precisely would be needed, and a decision can be taken about to what extent do we want to try and fund that through the HIF proposal, and to what extent we want to look elsewhere. Obviously, there's still £1.2 million set aside for OPDC in last year's budget, reflecting that as they grow, things will ebb and flow a little bit. If they underspend as they currently forecast to do in this year, there'll be a little bit more for that, and so there's another pot there that we can potentially call on.
I think on both, in terms of the previous answers to the question you gave on the LDDC, and again in that evidence, we realised when it wasn't rocket science that joint ventures might speed up and accelerate some of the housing processes. I've previously asked you questions, Mr. Mayor, about the role of this building and operating. I think you mentioned earlier, I think in relation to policing, which was quite a good one, about silo operation. So one of the issues, and I know it's long term, but in terms of if growth, the acceleration of growth is important in terms of some of these issues, what directions are we giving to other parts of the GLA to help OPDC achieve not just this if we're successful in that bid, but other issues? Do you know what I mean? Can other parts of the GLA come to play, as we're doing, as we found out through the reports that we commissioned, that the LDC, we can accelerate some of this process by joint ventures or other parts? What directions are we giving other parts of the organisation to come in and help or not help, as the case may be?
Before David answers, can I just remind us that OPDC is unique in a sense because it is so brownfield. The infrastructure required to make this developable is massive, and so it's unlike the other joint ventures we would work on, and NLDC is so far advanced compared to OPDC, so it's just worth bearing in mind that except for a small part of OPDC which you can develop sooner rather than later, the rest is quite a long way off, so just worth remembering that. Sorry, David.
But Mr. Mayor, but always it's long term, but it's what you do now in preparing makes it happen in the long term and not even longer term.
No, but let me give you an example, if I may. So, for example, we've set up a land fund of £250 million. And the idea is this revolves and it's used in the present. So, for example, if representations were made to use some of this money or all of it for OPDC, I suspect the advice to me would be this may not be sensible because it's tied up for the next 15 years. That's what I meant by examples of joint ventures taking place on this.
Yeah. So in terms, really what we're trying to do, obviously, with Homes for Londoners and generally, as I said, and in an LLDC context, is we're trying to avoid duplication across the group. Yeah. So we have brought together physically GLA Housing and Land, OPDC, TfL Property in the same space at Union Street, so that they all sit together, and that clearly will help collaboration. What obviously we're seeing is not just the OPDC HIF bid. There are a number of HIF bids that have been submitted, and we await expressions of interest on those. As we understand where the government is positive and it may be less positive about, then we start working out, well, what does that mean for us in terms of resource? How do we structure ourselves? How can we use money from HIF bid? How can we use housing and land resources, etc.? And how can we do this most efficiently? Already we have a member of staff from Housing and Land working with OPDC and working on a particular project there. So that, is one of the initial projects there has already started. I spoke yesterday with the chair of OPDC about how we can build on this and how we can ensure that we have a clear view on what of the work they need is done by Homes for Londoners and what work that their own direct staff do, and we get the right balance so that we're as effective about this as we can be. So those discussions are ongoing, and as we get more clarity around the government's likely direction on the HIF bids, then we'll be able to firm up some of that.
Just for clarity, is this the only GLA family bid that's gone in for London, or are there other bids that this might be relevant to my colleagues' questions later on?
There's a whole series of bids across the GLA group. TfL have put in HIF bids, the Royal Docks, there's a whole series
and they've all gone into this fund?
There's been all made bids against the HIF fund, yes.
Okay, all right, okay. And so there are budgetary issues there that, well, I'll leave it to my colleague to maybe pick up and where they may be if we're successful in those other bids.
Potentially, yes, but obviously, as David said earlier, we need to review what the result is and then the consequences that might have there for budget. So this will take some time during 18-19 to sort out.
Okay. It does belie an issue about prioritising and about needs, going back to the Mayor's points around some of these issues and who's coordinating that and submitting those issues. Have we got an assessment anywhere about what, if we were successful in this particular project, what would it mean to be for the speeding up of delivery in terms of some of that infrastructure development or not? Do we have any assessment?
I don't have an assessment in front of me. The OPDC business plan is going to its next board meeting hopefully for approval, and so that will confirm the direction of travel, and then more detail will be put in. Beyond that, clearly, if the HIF bid for OPDC isn't successful and we're just rejected, firstly, we'd be very disappointed because all the signs are it's a very strong bid, but clearly we would need to talk about what's next, because that plays into the wider point that we've made about Eldoret Common and Park Road before, which is that this is a huge opportunity not just for London but for the country, and we need to deal with government in place that provides the resources to achieve what is needed up there. And as the Mayor said, there is a significant amount of work to do on the infrastructure front in order to be able to really take advantage of the opportunity up there, and that is something in one form or another that the government is going to have to contribute with, just as it has in a different way in places like Ebbsfleet.
Okay. Now, where are we on the memorandum of understanding in terms of the land deals and progressing that? Because it was a big issue last year. Lots of it was wait and see, but we needed to clear the decks on this issue. And recently, the chair, I think, speaking to the Assembly, thought it was a good deal for London by and large. We were hesitant at one stage where we thought it was a good deal. She's come and looked over it. She thinks it is. But where are we actually on doing the right issues to clear the decks in this project?
So there are two real advantages to the memorandum of understanding. The first is it kind of placed a hold on those sites. Network Rail or people are kind of unilaterally selling the sites before a strategic plan can be put together. So from an OPDC perspective, that is a real positive. Secondly, it allows us to negotiate over what the sale price of those sites would be. It doesn't give us to them for free or anything like that, but at least allows the basis of a negotiation. So where we are is that the Chair of OPDC has exchanged letters with the Secretary of State. There's very good alignment there about now getting started, getting into the detail on particular sites there, and going in a real tangible sense from a memorandum of understanding to actually making something happen in individual sites. It's clear that the memorandum of understanding, even on its own terms, isn't a perfect document. There are some sites up there OPDC feel actually should have been included in it, but weren't, and things like that. So there are loads of things to work through, and at official level, all that stuff is now going on, and that hopefully then provides the support to start taking tangible action on individual sites, supported with funding that's needed to help us move forward on the infrastructure side.
And just my final question, really, just going back to the housing issue, just before my colleague goes into great detail. If I'm an housing association sitting on a strategic site and I put in a bid for this money, for the Housing Infrastructure Fund, can that have an impact on the GLA budget and in terms of where we spend our money? And is there any coordination around these bids at all? So even a third party, it doesn't have to be a housing association. I think that then, because they're like developers, but local authorities could do it without reference to us? So
the way the Housing Infrastructure Fund works is there's kind of two categorisations. Yep. There's the larger, more strategic schemes, which in London, the GLA, we have to submit. So this is one, as David mentioned, others of those. Local authorities are able to submit smaller schemes, smaller bids. They need our support to do that, but effectively the HIF fund divides into two separate pots in terms of just larger and smaller.
Just to reassure you, Len, so last summer James Murray spent a lot of time with local authorities making sure that we were chimed in relation to the things only we can bid for because of our scale, the things only they can bid for, to make sure there's cross-fertilisation, and we fed into some of the local authorities' submissions. And they know all about ours as well. So there was a lot of teamwork taking place there. Because if you're CLG, what is not attractive is if you're seeing GLA saying something completely inconsistent with what councils are saying. And so it makes all of our applications stand a better chance of winning if we're speaking to each other, and we did speak to each other.
And it is local authorities that make the bids, not other partners?
So there are two separate parts of this pot. One of it is local authorities, one of it is our scale GLA.
Oh, right. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Just a tidy up question on the Housing Infrastructure Fund. Our understanding is that the shortlisting is due to take place this month, and that the final decision will be September of this year, so halfway through the financial year. I accept everything that's been said, that we don't know whether it will be all of it, some of it, none of it. Let's assume it's all of it. When would the drawdown be expected? So what I'm getting at with this is, would it be expected in this year, and would we therefore have to make in-year adjustments to accommodate that?
I mean, the key issue is having spent all the money that we gain by March 21. And that's the key criteria, going back to Len's earlier question. Okay. And the liability potentially, if we don't spend all the, say we won £1 billion of HIF, for instance, if we only spent, say, 900 million collectively, then there is a potential liability upon the GLA for that balance. It obviously depends on the negotiations with government and whether government will ultimately follow through on that. So that's the real big risk, rather than what level of spend we may need to incur in 18-19. It's really the end point that's the difficulty.
So,
okay, good, because the reason I asked the question, sorry, I'll come back to you in a moment, Mr. Bellamy, because I'm not trying to trip on over. This is a fact-based question. Do we have sufficient flexibility in the budget to adjust to the circumstance where we get the money, in order that we don't end up in a big rush before March 2021 to avoid any penalties?
So I guess what I would say is that clearly in 18-19, that you wouldn't be expecting the bulk of the HIF money if you're saying, oh, we need to buy some land, we need to procure somebody to undertake a major piece of infrastructure work. You wouldn't expect that money to go out in 18-19. What you would want to expect in 18-19 is then to be cracking on, so that you could start the tendering processes and actually make it reality, so that you're there in good time before March 2021 for the reason that David sets out. So what obviously, as I said, the HIF process allows for some money from those bids to be used for those purposes. And so what we need to do is, if it is this month, as we hope, we get an indication of which bids are likely to be successful, we can start saying, okay, right, are we able to the sort of scale of expenditure that we will need to support this? Can it be financed from the HIF, given the scale of money the government is talking about offering for each individual project? Or do we need to look at something else? If we need to look at something else, that's when our housing and land resources come into play. It's also where we have things we talked about earlier in the meeting around one-off items that the Mayor's yet to take decisions about, whether that's the strategic pool or anything else. We have flexibility there about those decisions at this time.
Okay, so you're confident at this point in time that should the bid be successful and the full amount be awarded, that we would have sufficient flexibility, and it might be, as you just alluded to, maybe it's the additional windfall from council tax, for example, that we could direct some of that to the OPDC to make sure that they are properly resourced to use that money wisely.
So yeah, I mean, that's the sort of thing that we can look at.
Fine, thank you. We're going to move on now to housing, which is our penultimate section. Without in any way wanting to hurry members, just to point out it's 20 to 1, and so we might want to be a bit direct with some of our questions. Assembly Member Berry.
Try and do this as briskly as I can. Obviously, this is the first time we've been able to look and ask questions about the bits of the budget under the GLA Mayor lines. A lot of those are to do with housing and regeneration, so we do have a few questions. One of them is the huge challenge of what you're trying to achieve with what isn't a very large budget. You've got 3.15 billion from the government, but that's over your term, essentially. And David Luntz told us that there's a massive gap between that and what London actually could do with. He said something like 2.7 billion a year would be the ideal amount of money that we would be spending on affordable housing grants. So can you tell us what you're doing in this budget to try and bridge that gap and do more with less, effectively?
So there's two separate things. One is what the draft London plan says the needs of London are, the housing target. Roughly speaking, 65,000 homes a year. I hope I got the figure right. With a significant percentage being affordable. Separate from that is the deal we've struck with government in relation to the Housing Investment Fund, £3.15 billion, which is linked to starts, 90,000 starts by 2021. It's a 5-year programme. And so they're separate things. I think what David was alluding to, everyone's called David here, what David was alluding to was is that if we were to meet the needs of London as set out in the draft and the plan, we need to spend £2.7 billion a year. The money we've secured from government is, roughly speaking, only £0.5 billion a year. So we're not going to meet the needs of London, is the short answer. So in relation to, are we going to get maximum bang for our buck for the £3.15 billion? Answer, yes. It's 90,000 starts by 2021, and there's a projection for each year. So a good way for you to assess whether we're on schedule is by March 2018, literally 2 months away, we would hope to have 12,500 starts. And so if you're sort of doing a graph 4 years forward, if we're well short of 12,500, we've got to ask questions about whether we're going to meet 90,000 starts by 2021. Just doing basic maths. The good news, we've reached deals with housing associations and councils for most of the starts, so we should do it. The way I'm told it works in previous years is HAs tend to backload. So you're seeing, so that's just the way they work. I'm not judging them, but that's how they work. So I'm told not to panic, that come January, February, the number of starts is nowhere near approaching 12,500. But don't be surprised if, lo and behold, come March, there's a sudden increase. So the best way to assess, Sean, how we're doing is let's look at the figures post-March 2018.
Okay, thank you very much. And we do now have, we've asked you before for the targets year by year. I think 12,500 is the bottom end of your target.
There's a spectrum, so the advice we received again is because of the huge uncertainties we can talk about if you like. Best to give a band, I think it's between 12.5 and 16.
That's right.
But and again, the advice is as we go through the full 5 years, we're more likely to get near the top band than the bottom band because progress is made. But let's be clear, the context, we've never before as London or a previous mayor got anywhere near, the bottom band. So we are being very, very, very ambitious. I think we'd be doubling the record numbers made by previous mayors, so it's very ambitious.
And the spending plans under the Affordable Housing Programme line in the GLA mayor budget, it doubles between 2018-19 and 2019-20, then it goes up again by another 50%, and then it goes up again, another doubling by 2021-22. It's quite an exponential
and that's the way I'm told.
Increase.
I did interrogate these figures. That's how the cycle works, and so I'm told nothing to be surprised by there. Don't forget, some of it is the deals we made with the house association. They've got to identify the land. They've got to make sure there's a package in place. They've got to apply for planning permission. They've got to get permission. They've got to get on site. So these things do take some time.
Okay. In terms of your own spending, in the revenue part of the budget, the Housing and Land Directorate is underspent this year, and then its budget stays flat for the entire rest of the time. This is page 17. Right?
I'm not sure what it is. Do you know what page that is?
Yes, page 17 of the draft budget. Housing and Land Directorate, it just looks all very flat, and you would expect that to be increasing kind of alongside the amount of housing we're expecting. Can you explain that?
Well, I guess I would say that housing and land. If you're thinking about the £3.15 billion, that's Housing and Land is staffed to work with the housing associations, work with the other people who are bidding for that. The things that you will get more variability about probably are around property work that relates to the GLA's own land holdings, and that obviously will be a bit more cyclical, and also some of that then gets charged against the GLAP, as we talked about before, because it's work on essentially commercial activity, and that necessarily means that you might not be changing the staffing levels, but you ebb and flow. And obviously, this is an area that we're coming back to in the context of the HIF bids and providing more support there, as we previously discussed.
Okay, but you're confident that the amount that's in that budget now is going to see you through all this activity?
So, yeah, housing land absolutely would be coming back and asking for more money if they needed it. I can promise you of that. They haven't done so, but that we do know the executive director is planning, when we get an indication on the HIF bids, to look at things again, and so absolutely we're going to be doing that.
Just practical examples of why your question is so important is we've already employed, the team has viability experts for the reasons we've rehearsed before. We're currently recruiting for experts to help with the land fund, to identify land, to do the deals. So you're right, but David Lawrence isn't shy coming forward asking for more money for his team. So, and for the reasons the Chief of Staff has said, don't be surprised if they come back and ask for more resources and stuff. The good news is because they're in the same building now, there is sharing of money. So TfL are there, OPDC are there, LDC are there. So actually it's a good example of actually you can save monies by getting rid of the silos and stuff.
Yeah, happy that they've moved in together, as it were. Can I ask then, in terms of the viability experts, the fast track route that you've put forward for getting more affordable housing out of developers, what evidence do you have so far on this working?
Yeah, so I've got early evidence, but it's very early, so the numbers are small. So just take it with a pinch of salt, because you can get too optimistic or too pessimistic. So just to remind ourselves, this means that you as a developer can come forward with a plan. If it's 35% genuinely affordable, we'll fast track the process, no need to go through the hoops of viability. So since I established this, we've had 17 applications delivering 35% or more affordable homes, 45% of residential referable applications. So 45% since I started this versus 13% in the last year when Boris Johnson was the mayor.
And that's across all applications, not just the ones that your viability team have looked at?
Only the big ones come to us. So obviously, above a certain scale, they come to us, and so there's been that many that have gone through, which is obviously great news.
Okay, great.
But take it with a pinch of salt for obvious reasons. This is from May to November last year, so hopefully it'll stay that promising.
Okay. Quite a lot of the activity in here, in the budget too, is also to do with the housing zones. In the budget it says that you are reviewing them, that they're going to be higher priority ones are going to be selected. How are you doing that in terms of focusing the spending, and what will happen to the housing zones that don't make the grade, that aren't prioritised?
Well, the budget has been over-programmed, so that's not new. So £600 million in total. The GLA's entered into contractual commitments of 369 million. So it's 369 of the 600 has contractually been dealt with. In order to accelerate the contraction, a deadline was set for 31st of Jan 2018. So we've encouraged all outstanding contracts to be signed by 31st of January 2018. Some of the applications won't be successful because it's been over-programmed, which is not unusual. And there are three separate parts of the housing zone budgets, which I'm happy to talk you through: loan funding, grant funding, revenue funding. And there's a good spread across London. There's a good spread in relation to the pitches for each of these. Loan funding, oversubscribed. Grant funding, heavily oversubscribed. Revenue funding, good spread. 11 boroughs are receiving a share of the £600,000 for the housing zones revenue funding.
Okay, and how are you deciding which ones to prioritise? Just this is the bidding process that they're doing, is it?
Yeah, there's a criteria. I'm not sure if David Lunt's dealt with you, but there is a criteria to which they've got to go through. So for the revenue funding, for example, some of the criteria was, does a borough have resource and expertise? Obviously, there's no point us funding something without that, and so that's been checked. And so £600,000 is made available over 2 years to help with revenue costs, including additional staff to support the housing zones. And 11 boroughs are receiving this across the piece, outer and inner, of all different political shades as well.
In terms of the grant funding, you said it was heavily oversubscribed.
Yeah.
The grant funding line in the capital spending plan here, that seems to be front-loaded, i.e. it dies away by 2021-22. Can you explain that?
Well, once David finds that, so the grant funding, just to give you an idea of it being heavily oversubscribed, at peak, £700 million applied for against a £400 million budget. And so we've concentrated the focus on the programme to commit the £400 million by early 2018. And hopefully David's found that in
I mean, I guess that, that's just will be reflecting the latest profile of when we think the money will actually go out the door. It's not, obviously the deals get made and then the payments are conditional or released at certain stages, and so that will be, at the time that submission was put together, would have been, so probably the mid-year expectation of how the money would go out, and obviously that will ebb and flow as more contracts are entered into and things change in the normal course of things.
It's also just worth adding that the grant element is 400 million of the 600 million, and you've got virtually 400 million of commitments set out there already, so you've actually virtually exhausted the resource. There's a few more commitments to come through, but essentially that's the programme that you can deliver for 400 million.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is about the London Housing Bank. We had discussions about this last year. It was not doing what it was supposed to be doing, and we seem to be roughly in the same position still. How have your discussions with DCLG gone on just using that money differently?
Just to remind you, what I'll let David answer, the other David, is the borrowing is quite cheap. There are lots of terms attached to this borrowing, so people weren't keen to use the housing bank monies. And so over to you, David, in relation to conversations with CLG and trying to, because we tried to renegotiate with the government to relax the regime around this.
Unfortunately, we've not been able to reach a conclusion on that, and as the Mayor says, the problem has been that the terms have not been attractive. We're hoping that we can renegotiate the terms to be more satisfactory to actually be able to draw down that money, but at the moment the terms we have are not sufficiently attractive to RSLs and our partners.
And the government are saying that they don't want to negotiate about this in isolation. They want to look at it as part of their wider thinking about housing. So we've asked, and we will continue pressing.
Okay, I'm right that if we don't draw it down, it just goes to waste. It's not money that we've got that we have to spend. It just doesn't come if we don't.
There is a potential, if we're unsuccessful, that the funding would be lost, yes.
Are we giving them any ideas for alternative things they might do with that kind of fund?
We've given an extensive set of proposals, which I think would be very plausible, but obviously we're still negotiations.
Okay, thank you very much. And then can you also tell us more about the £250 million land fund? One thing that it says in the budget is we're not getting actually any budget line for it yet to say where the money's coming from or when it's going to be spent or what's going to happen. So can we maybe have that in the final budget? And can you tell us more about it now?
Maybe I'll say a little bit about where we are, and then he hasn't spoken yet, so maybe Martin, you want to explain about the financial treatment of it. So where we are is obviously the decision to set up the land fund has been taken. The governance structure has been put in place. Mayoral's decision to do that has been done. So there's an investment committee whose purpose is to review and recommend individual transactions, including independent members. That is now in place. That committee's had its first meeting. There is one site already identified that they are seeking to progress. So you can't, for commercial reasons, talk about that now, but hopefully before too long we will be able to announce that. And the work to identify further sites is continuing apace. So that's really a kind of progress update. Martin, on the finance side.
Because I think, as I said earlier, there's a commercial element to this. Buy land, get developed, you get housing, you sell it, you get the receipt. So once the fund is up, fully running and recycling, the receipts will be available for the purchase. In the setup, what we'll use is, in effect, is GLA's cash flow. And of course, in the GLA budget, we don't give you a cash flow. So, in a way, GLA's own cash resources will provide the funds for the initial purchases, and then obviously it'll get reimbursed. And when we get the sale, and we talked about this, and I think what we'll do for the budget report we will issue later this month is have a memorandum account is showing what GLA cash flow is going up front first. Now, it is possible that when we come to this January, well, in fact, if we haven't got an agreement in place, we might be able to indicate an indicative plan. But it's something we can update in the future budget process in our monitoring. How much GLA resources you can say has been tied up at the initial setup stage. But not having a cash flow budget, it doesn't show in any of the lines because it's not any direct expenditure until we've contracted to do the purchase.
Okay, I think that
so
makes sense.
We've got to try and give some transparency.
Yeah, we'll look forward to some more
information. Cash flow
information.
before, in essence, the purchases pay for themselves.
Yeah. No, we'll look forward to seeing more about that.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I think we're all interested in is it's £250 million. Could it be larger, essentially, than that? Is this a pilot that you're running to see if it can be recycled in a reasonable time? And are there more creative things that could be done with it later? But we can talk about that maybe another time because I'm worried about that.
I think for purposes of the mayoral direction I've signed, it's for £250 million. It's a revolving fund. Obviously, if we were to make profits on this fund, then obviously there may be flexibility there. But at the moment, the investment committee know that the sums we're talking about is 250. But the reason why your question is important is, if, for example, this time next year, you would see there's £250 million sitting in the cash flow that's not being used, raise questions. Why aren't we helping unblock lands and all the rest of it and stuff? So we want to provide transparency, but the investment committee recognise that the aspiration is to make sure we use this. The money's always out with the expectation for us to come in and purchase more.
And I could add our recommendations to Mayor to have this investment committee with external people on it is to have a governance structure that could be scalable if other funding partners wanted to come in due course. But it's just something at the early stages, and I think we need to prove the concept to the Mayor.
Yeah, we will probably have more questions about that. I mean, questions like, is it going to make a profit in a sense? Are we expecting it to bring a return, and then you've got all sorts of other partners who might be interested in that kind of fund. But we'll perhaps come back to that later.
Okay, thank you. Just a quick tidying up question. When David Luntz appeared in front of us on the 22nd of November, we discussed the affordable housing starts, and you made 2 points earlier on. I'm paraphrasing you now. You implied that it starts slowly and speeds up, and that we might be off beam on January, February, but it's the end of March that counts. I take both points. At the meeting in November, the number of affordable housing starts for this financial year was 570. Do you know what the figure is today?
No, the figure before Christmas was also quite low, 723 or something. I'm told a number of contracts were due to be signed in December and early January, but we'll have to drop you a line.
So we're waiting on the end of December figure, which clearly the 723 would have been, I imagine, the end of November figure, and so we're now waiting for the end of December figure, which clearly we expect to see an uplift.
What's, just for clarification, what constitutes a start? The grant of planning permission or the first spade in the ground?
That's a technical question. I believe the answer is a spade in the ground, but there are probably ways in the housing and planning industry of kind of being creative around that.
That's again, it's not a past critical point. That's what I'm trying to get to, is because actually, of course, it's been a point well made, and I think accepted by everyone. You can't live in a start; you live in a completed home, and I understand why we're measured on starts, but actually starts tend to lead to finishes, we hope. And that was the point of asking that question.
I know you're not being mischievous, but just it's even worse than that. So the way it works is, if on a development, the plan is for 750 units, and the development's begun, not even a spade in the ground, that will count as a start.
Yeah.
And so that's why you're right to that's not how the rule world operates, but that's how.
Okay. So we'll write to Mr. Galley in the usual way.
A definition.
Thank you. Right, we're going to move on to the final section now. We're almost there, members, which is Environment, and Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. There's obviously a lot of different areas in the environment strategy and the budget that relates to that I could pick out, but we're now right at the end of our meeting, so there's just two areas that I'm going to focus on. One is one that we raised with you after our November meeting, and we wrote in our pre-budget report to ask about the funding for domestic retrofit and energy projects, obviously an area that's particularly close to my heart. You wrote back to us, Mr. Mayor, and explained that that is funding that has not been cut, but it's just contained within one budget line. And I just wondered if we could unpack that a bit about exactly what projects are going to be, projects and programmes are going to continue to be funded in that sort of less than 10 million budget line. Are we definitely continuing with Renew, Refit? Is that where community renewables is going in? How are we pulling in funding from elsewhere?
So there's quite a lot to unpack in relation to the environment funding package. So for carbon reduction alone, during the 4-year, in capital terms, it's £24.5 million, so it's way above the £1 million you referred to. That's £24.5 million, and I can provide you a breakdown with that. I've got it listed here, but for sake of brevity, I can write you with those figures. It includes £10 million over 4 years to replace inefficient commercial boilers. It includes monies in relation to the energy supply company. It includes money to do £10 million for fuel poverty action plan. The good news is we can switch this particular budget between capital and revenue, which is good for the issues that you care passionately about. In relation to the Better Boilers scheme, you'll be aware the whole budget for 17-18 was allocated, and if there's ways we can make that more transparent to you, we're happy to do so. But we've got details of how all this £24.5 million money is being spent, which I'm happy to drop you a note on if that helps.
That would be helpful, and also on the issue of where, I think it was something that Fiona Fletcher-Smith brought up with us about where you were hoping to pull in money from elsewhere. I mean, obviously there are some of the smaller community renewable companies who have been quite successful using, the cooperative financing and Mongoose Energy to pull in money to support some of those projects. So information on where that additional money is going to come from would be helpful. The other point I did want to raise, which you just touched on, was carbon reduction. We did raise this with Shirley when she came to the Environment Committee to talk about the environment strategy. And our reading is that in the early days up to 2025, carbon reduction is going to be aiming for a lower target of 52% rather than in the previous strategy where it was 60%. Won't that then make hitting the overall reduction figure, which hasn't changed for 2050, more difficult? And given global warming and the particularly horrific things that have been happening around the world in terms of endless hurricanes, as it seemed, in the Caribbean, would it not be better to stick with the 60% reduction target up to 2025?
Well, I can look into that. I mean, you'll be aware we're going to be zero carbon city by 2050. What we don't want to do is backload it like we just talked about other things being backloaded and stuff. So I'm happy to look into that. I've not got it in front of me and stuff. I'm not sure if David's got that information about the 2025 target being changed.
It's the short answer is that a large portion of the previous 60% target and also zero carbon target by 2050 is reliant on government policies and actions. And so really what we're trying to do is, yes, absolutely be ambitious, because we're completely committed to the zero carbon by 2050, but equally we have to be realistic about what can be achieved, and that we're not going to be able to achieve things ahead of the government introducing changes.
I know that, just to reassure you, as somebody who takes very seriously my responsibility in this area, as Vice Chair of C40, we do lots of work with other cities and happy to pinch ideas, see what they're doing. So I want you to think we're not being ambitious, but it's just in the context of where we are, we're trying to go as far as we can.
And we will be introducing 5-year carbon budgets so that the commitments that we're making over each period, we're absolutely ensuring transparency about the delivery.
I do feel that, that is a positive response, but I do think being really ambitious up to 2025 is crucial. And if there are lessons that can be learned from the other C40 cities, then it's encouraging to hear that we will be taking those on board. And I'm sure that's something the Environment Committee, if not Budget and Performance, will be coming back to. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that. Right, we've now reached the end. Mr Mayor, can I thank you and your officers for your attendance today? Members, can we note the reports and the answers given?
Noted.
Thank you. Can we delegate authority to me in consultation with the party group leaders and Caroline Pigeon to agree the committee's response to the Mayor's draft consultation budget for 18-19? Thank you very much. Item 4, Budget and Performance Committee Work Programme. For the 5th time in a week, can we...
You're not changing it.
Can we note the reports and the remainder of the work programme for the remainder of the 17-18 year?
You're already noted.
Thank you, members. Date of the next meeting, I'm sure you will all be very relieved to note, is actually the 6th of March 2018 at 10 o'clock. But there will be a potentially interesting budget monitoring subcommittee meeting, which I told you about. That's a bit after that. That's Wednesday, the 21st of March 2018 at 2 o'clock. There is no any other urgent business, so the meeting is closed. Thank you.
Do we get the draft report before the term?
GLA, Chamber, Sound. GLA, Chamber, Sound. GLA, Chamber.